The chamber is open and full of whispers.
Before we dive in, check the link in description if you want exclusive timelines, members-only videos you won't find on YouTube, all on our Patreon. That is the first thing wrong. He has woken from nightmares 300 times in this bedroom. He knows exactly what that feels like. The cold sweat, the green light still burning behind his eyelids, the specific weight of a memory that isn't his pressing down on his chest until he can breathe again. This is not that. There is no green light. His scar is not burning. He is sitting upright in the dark with someone else's terror lodged inside his ribs like a splinter. He sits with it, doesn't move. The fear doesn't belong to him, and he knows this with a certainty he cannot explain. The way you know a coat is not yours when you put it on and find it fits wrong in the shoulders. The emotion is structured differently. It is the fear of someone who immediately starts counting things, cataloging exits, assessing variables, reaching for books even in the flinching first second of panic. Harry's fear has never once reached for a book. Outside, the Dursley street is absolutely still. One lamp burning amber at the far end, Hedwig asleep in her cage, his trunk locked under the floorboard. He looks at his right wrist. There is nothing there. Of course there is nothing there. And yet the skin just above his pulse point feels different. A warmth without a source, the faint sensation of something resting against it that has no weight and no color and cannot be seen. He goes back to sleep. He doesn't manage it. 212 miles northeast, Hermione Jean Granger is sitting on the floor of her bedroom with a newspaper in her lap and 12 books in the air around her. Not stacked, not shelved, floating. All of them at once, which she has not done since she was 8 years old, and angry at a boy who had called her something she had promised herself not to repeat. She has the newspaper spread across both knees. The headline is large. The photograph below it shows a gaunt, wild-eyed man with matted black hair who grins at the camera with too many teeth. Sirius Black escapes Azkaban. Minister Fudge calls for immediate capture. Extremely dangerous, believed to be he who must not be named most loyal supporter. She has read it 4 times. She reads it again. Her magic is moving through the room in slow, massive tides, like something old turning over in deep water. The curtains lift and fall without wind. The books rotate. The lamp on her desk flickers. Not from a fault in the bulb, but because something in the room is drawing on the current. On the wall above her desk, 3 lines of ink she wrote last Tuesday bleed slightly at the edges, the letters softening and running as if the paper has decided to reject them. She doesn't notice any of it. She is still reading. Sirius Black, last known associate of you-know-who, believed responsible for the deaths of 12 muggles and 1 wizard, he who must not be named most loyal. The books drop all at once. Every one of them. They hit the floor in a cascade of sound that should have woken her parents, and she flinches at the noise and then sits in the sudden quiet, both hands pressed flat against her sternum, breathing carefully through her nose. She is not afraid of Sirius Black. She is afraid of what Sirius Black escaping from Azkaban means for Harry. It is a cleaner emotion than general fear. She catalogues it in the 2 seconds after the books fall. Not diffuse anxiety, not nameless dread, but a specific targeted terror with an object and a set of logical downstream consequences. She reaches for the nearest fallen book before the echo of its landing has fully died. Her hands are steady. Something in her chest pulls toward the east. She does not notice this either. Harry writes her a letter. He doesn't think about it beforehand. He doesn't plan what to say. He sits at his desk with Hedwig watching him from the cage and the pre-dawn light still gray through the curtains, and he writes, and the strange thing, the thing he will think about for months without being able to explain, is that he knows what she needs to hear before he has decided what he wants to say. Not comfort. She doesn't want comfort. She wants information, and where he doesn't have information, she wants acknowledgement that the information is missing, and the missing of it is being taken seriously. He writes, I know. I woke up at about 3 and felt something. I think it was you reading the paper. Don't tell me that's not possible before you've thought about whether it could be. I'm fine. I'm paying attention. We should talk on the train. He signs it Harry, not Harry Potter, which feels suddenly important. He stares at the letter for a moment. Then he adds a line at the bottom. Don't spend the whole summer afraid. You're better than that, and so is whatever this is. He doesn't know where that last part comes from. He sends it anyway. Hedwig returns in 4 hours. The reply is 2 pages long, dense with Hermione's close handwriting that slants slightly forward when she is thinking faster than her hand wants to move. The first paragraph is about Sirius Black, every publicly available fact about his imprisonment. the specific legal anomaly that no trial was ever conducted, and a preliminary framework of 3 possible explanations for his escape ranked by probability. The second paragraph contains one sentence. How did you know what to say? Harry reads it twice. He doesn't write back. He wouldn't know where to start. Ron is talking about the Chudley canons. Harry is listening, or mostly listening, or performing the particular version of listening that involves nodding at the correct intervals while your attention is somewhere else entirely. He is watching the compartment door. He knows she is on the train. He has known since platform 9 3/4, a low-frequency awareness of location that requires no effort to maintain and no explanation he is prepared to give. And when the door slides open and Hermione Granger steps through with her trunk and her cat and her expression of someone who has been organizing information for 6 weeks and is ready to begin presenting it, he stops performing and starts paying actual attention. Ron says something about the canon's keeper. Harry says yeah without breaking eye contact with the door. Hermione sits down across from him. Ron trails off. The compartment is not quiet. The train is moving, the wheels are loud on the track, and Crookshanks is producing a low, sustained sound of displeasure at the carrier. But something in the quality of the space between the 2 seats changes when they look at each other, and Ron, who is neither stupid nor unobservant, registers it as a physical thing, a shift in the air like barometric pressure, dropping in glances between them with an expression that is not yet alarmed, but is paying attention. You felt it too, Hermione says. She is not asking, woke me up at 3 a.m, Harry says. 3:14, she says. I looked at the clock after the books fell. He nods. The fear felt like yours, the structure of it, like someone checking a list while they're panicking. Something moves through her face, brief, controlled, quickly processed and put somewhere. You could distinguish the emotional structure. I didn't know that's what I was doing at the time. It's just what it was like. She opens her bag. She produces a notebook. It is not a school notebook. It is a personal one, slim, the cover worn at the corner, and she has been writing in it since July because Harry knows this the way he knows a fact he was present for, which he was not. She opens it to a page dense with notes and places it on the seat beside her, not showing it to him yet, just placing it where she can reach it. I've been researching blood covenants, she says. Not for school. I went to Hampstead Library after the 3rd time it happened and found a reference in a 1952 text called Inherited Obligations in Pre-Ministry Magical Law. I had to order it through interlibrary loan. Ron says, what's a blood covenant? Neither of them looks at him. Tell me everything, Harry says. Hermione's expression does a thing it has not quite done before. A slight recalibration, something settling into place like tumblers in a lock. She is, Harry realizes, not performing intelligence. She never has been. She is simply operating without the social modifier that usually sits between what she knows and what she says. The learned habit of making herself smaller so the room doesn't feel crowded, and she has taken it off somewhere between Hampstead and King's Cross and left it behind. He wonders when he started noticing the difference. I think we need to go to Gringotts, she says, before term starts properly. There's a legal mechanism called a heritage audit, and I believe under Goblin custodial law we have grounds to request one without ministry notification or involvement. We, he says, both of us, yes. He has the expression of someone watching a conversation happen in a language they almost speak. This has been going on all summer, both of you? Since July 31st, Hermione says, which is Harry's birthday, and she looks briefly at Harry when she says it and he looks briefly back, and that is as close as either of them comes, in this moment, to naming the obvious. Okay, Ron says. Okay, what is actually Hermione? Harry says it as though they are the only 2 people in the compartment, not unkindly, just with the particular focus of someone who has realized something he should have said weeks ago and wants to say it correctly before the moment closes. You're the most brilliant person I've ever met. She blinks, not a social blink, a processing blink. You don't mean that as a compliment, she says. No, he says. I mean it as an assessment. We're about to walk into something very old and very serious, and I'm not going to be able to think my way through it the way you can. That matters. I just wanted to say it like a fact, instead of a nice thing. The Ragnuk Accords of 982, she says. Start there. Ron stares at both of them. His mouth is slightly open. He closes it. He looks out the window at the countryside moving past, and does the particular arithmetic of someone counting the number of ways his year has just changed without his permission. Outside, the sun on the fields is warm and ordinary. The thread between Harry's wrist and the east is still invisible. The train moves north. The letter to Gringotts had taken Hermione 4 drafts. Not because she didn't know what to say. She knew exactly what to say by the end of the first paragraph of Inherited Obligations and Preministry Magical Law, which she had read in its entirety on a Tuesday in August, while her mother called her down for dinner twice and she didn't hear either time. The 4 drafts existed because the letter had to be precise in a specific way, not merely correct, but written in the legal register that Goblin custodial law recognized as a formal instrument. There was a difference. She had found a secondary text that explained the difference. She had rewritten accordingly. Harry had signed the final version without reading it. She had watched him do this from across her kitchen table, the pen moving across the bottom of the page in his cramped, slightly backward handwriting, and she had decided not to comment on it. He had looked up and said, simply, "You checked it." And that had been the entire conversation. She had found she didn't mind. Gringotts Bank in the early morning was a different institution than the one that existed at midday. The marble entrance hall was not yet full. The chandeliers overhead dropped cold white light onto the long counters, and the scratch of quills and the precise movements of goblins who had been conducting the world's financial architecture since before the Ministry of Magic existed as a concept, and who conducted it now with the same indifference they had always brought to the enterprise. Nothing about the building suggested it cared whether you were there. Nothing about the building suggested it needed to. They crossed the floor together. Their footsteps were quiet. Ron had come as far as the door and stopped there with his arms folded, and his expression that of someone who has decided the wisest course of action is to wait outside, which Hermione had privately assessed as correct. The goblin at the central counter was taller than most, with a particular quality of stillness that indicated not inactivity, but the conservation of very deliberate energy. His name placard read, Iron Shard, Head Teller. His eyes, when he looked up, were the color of old bronze. He looked at Harry first, then at Hermione, then, and this was the thing she noticed, the small movement she filed immediately and did not react to, his gaze dropped briefly to the space between them, at nothing she could see, at something below the level of what she could currently perceive. His expression did not change, but something behind it did, the way a calculation completes itself invisibly, and what you see is only the settled answer. "We are here to request a heritage audit," Hermione said. She placed the letter on the counter. Under Ragnarok Accord Article 17, subsection 4. The request is co-signed by Harry James Potter, heir to the ancient house of Potter-Peveril. "I know why you are here," he said. His voice was low and carried the specific flatness of someone who finds performance unnecessary. The accord requires only the blood of the requesting party. The letter is adequate, but not required. He looked at Harry. "Your right hand, Lord Potter." Harry extended it without hesitation. Iron Shard produced a small implement, not dramatic, not ceremonial, just a precise tool for a precise function, and drew a single thin line across Harry's index finger. One drop of blood fell onto the counter's stone surface and spread in a shape that was not a circle. It moved in a specific direction. It moved east. The head teller watched it settle. "Follow me," he said. The vault was not near the others. They descended for long enough that the air changed twice, first colder, then something past cold, a temperature that had nothing to do with the absence of heat, and everything to do with the presence of something very old pressing against the walls from inside. The cart moved without apparent mechanism. The tunnels narrowed. The chandeliers gave way to torches, and then the torches to a light that had no visible source, pale gold, sourceless, emanating from the stone itself or from something the stone remembered. Iron Shard did not speak during the descent. He sat with his hands folded and his eyes forward, and the quality of his stillness became, in the silence, something closer to ceremony. The vault door was iron, not gold. Old iron, the kind that develops a surface like a skin over centuries, pitted and layered and entirely without ornament. There was no lock Harry could see. When his hand, Iron Shard had instructed this without words, simply gesturing, pressed flat against the center of the door, the iron did something he would later struggle to describe. It recognized him. Not the way a sensor recognizes a signal, the way a sleeping thing registers the approach of a familiar presence, and, without fully waking, opens. The door swung inward. The room beyond was small and entirely empty except for a single shelf, waist height, mounted at the far wall. On the shelf sat a case of dark wood, no larger than a book. The wood had warped slightly over 3 centuries into a shape that was almost organic, almost grown rather than made. Around its edges, at intervals, the faintest traces of gold and silver thread were visible. Not decorative, not structural, just present, the way a scent is present in a room long after the source has been removed. Harry picked it up. The warmth was immediate. Not heat, warmth. The specific temperature of something living. He looked at Hermione. She was already moving toward him. She took the case from him, set it on the floor, opened the clasp with hands that were completely steady, and unrolled what was inside. The document was not parchment. It was older than parchment, a material she would spend 2 weeks identifying later as a form of pressed vellum treated with something the text would refer to only as bonded mineral, which was not a potions term or an arithmancy term and existed in no reference she had yet encountered. It was the size of a broadsheet when fully extended. The writing on it was in 4 languages, 2 of which she recognized, Latin and an archaic form of English, and 2 of which she did not, which she noted without distress as information she would acquire. She read. Harry watched her read. Her face went through a sequence he observed carefully. First, pale, the specific pallor of someone encountering a number that is much larger than their working estimate. Then, a long, controlled breath through her nose. Then, the thing that happened in her eyes when information stopped being alarming and started being useful. It was a short transition. It always was. She sat down on the vault floor without looking for a chair because there was no chair and pulled out her notebook. 14, she said. 14 what? Harry sat across from her. Immediate legal consequences. 14 that I can identify from this section alone. She was writing as she spoke, not looking up. I'll go in order of importance. He said nothing. He did not interrupt. 1. The covenant classifies you as Lord Potter Peverell, not heir, not claimant, Lord, effective from the moment of resonance activation. That was July 31st. You have been legally an adult under Wisengamot Statute 1214 VI for 6 weeks, and no one has told you. 2. I hold co-equal status as Lady Dagworth-Granger by right of line through Alara Dagworth-Granger, squib daughter of Hector's heir, whose magical suppression has now been formally reversed by my reinheritance of the gift. 3. She paused. Her pen did not pause. The Dursleys' guardianship is void, has been void since July 31st. You could have walked out of that house 6 weeks ago, and the ministry would have had no legal mechanism to return you. Harry was quiet for a moment. Keep going, he said. She kept going. 4 through 9 covered Sirius Black, the specific Wisengamot statute that Lord Potter's standing activated, the filing mechanism that bypassed ministry interference, the precedent from 1743 that established a lord of an ancient house as a competent petitioner for trial proceedings on behalf of a wrongfully imprisoned party. She listed them without emphasis, each one clean and factual, building on the last. 10 through 12 concerned Hogwarts. Umbridge's name was not in the document. She had not happened yet. But the framework that would make her educational decrees legally inoperable against Lord Potter and his covenant counterpart was already present, codified in 1693 by people who had clearly anticipated that the ministry would, eventually, overreach into education. 13. Goblin custodianship of the covenant meant that any attempt to challenge its validity must be filed with the Gringotts legal archive first, not the ministry. The ministry would have no standing to review an instrument held under Goblin jurisdiction. It could object. It could not adjudicate. 14 she wrote last. She wrote it smaller than the others. She looked at it for a moment before she said it aloud. The bond cannot be severed. She said, not by the ministry, not by Dumbledore, not by Voldemort. There is a specific clause here, Article 9, that defines the conditions under which a blood covenant of this class can be dissolved. Both parties must consent. Both parties must be magically capable of the severance, and the covenant's own magic must concur. She set down her pen. The covenant is described in Article 9 as a semi-sentient instrument. It has standing to refuse dissolution, which means that 3 parties must agree to end this, and one of them is the bond itself. Harry looked at the document, still unrolled between them on the vault floor. Then nobody can take it, he said. Nobody, she said, has ever been able to take it. Ironshard had waited in the doorway through all of this. When Hermione closed her notebook and Harry began rolling the covenant back into its case, the goblin spoke for the second time since the descent. There is information I am required to share, he said. Under the Ragnuk Accords, the custodian of a blood covenant instrument must inform the claiming party of any prior access attempts to the vault. We are required to log them. Harry looked at him. How many attempts? 1. In the winter following the night of October 31st, 1981. Ironshard's voice carried nothing. No commentary, no inflection. He delivered it the way the bank delivered everything, as a statement of fact that required no embellishment, because the fact was sufficient. The petitioner identified himself as Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, headmaster of Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. He was denied. The vault requires the blood of the heir. He offered a letter of guardianship instead. The vault was quiet. Harry understood the timing without needing it explained. The winter of 1981, 2 months after his parents died. Dumbledore, having placed him with the Dursleys and knowing the Potter family's ancient connections, had gone looking for legal instruments that might complicate what he was building. He knew it existed, Hermione said. She was not asking. The request demonstrated specific knowledge of the instrument's location and legal classification, Ironshard said. Yes. Harry was still looking at the iron door, at the old metal and what it had held for 300 years, while the world outside moved through wars and ministries and one man's very careful management of a 13-year-old's understanding of his own life. He placed the case back on the shelf. Then he turned to the head teller. I want a flag placed on this vault, he said. Every access attempt, regardless of who makes it, reported to me directly, not through Hogwarts, not through the ministry, directly. That is within your right as the claiming party, Ironshard said. Including Dumbledore, Hermione said. She said it with no heat, just the particular precision of someone who wants to ensure there is no ambiguity in the record. Ironshard looked at her for a moment, then he bowed. Not a small courtesy bow, not the minimal gesture of professional acknowledgement. He bowed from the waist, the way a motion carries genuine weight when the person making it has decided, for reasons the motion does not explain, that the gesture is merited. Hermione held his gaze through it. She did not smile. The flag will be placed before you reach the surface, Ironshard said. They left the vault. The iron door closed behind them with a sound like something settling. In her notebook, on the page after 14, Hermione had already written the heading for the next section. Sirius Black, Filing Mechanism, Wisengamot Petition. Timeline. She wrote quickly. The cart began its ascent. Above them, September light was falling on a street that did not yet know what it contained. She found it by accident. The occlumency texts she had requested through Madame Pince were listed under restricted, not prohibited, simply restricted, which meant a signed note from a professor and a reason. She had submitted both. The reason she gave was independent study in advanced magical theory, which was true in the way a map is true, accurate in its broad strokes, entirely silent about the specific territory. She had been practicing the exercises for 11 days. The texts described the interior of the mind as a landscape to be ordered, rooms to be locked, doors to be strengthened, the surface thoughts arranged deliberately so that a legilimens encountered only what the practitioner chose to present. It was, as Hermione understood it, fundamentally an exercise in architecture. She was good at architecture. What the texts did not describe, what she had not found in any reference she consulted, was that a bonded pair already maintained a form of shared mental space that functioned as passive protection against external intrusion. She discovered this on the 11th night, when she reached inward to build a room in her mind and found the architecture already partially complete, warmer than she had generated it, constructed from a different logic than her own. Someone was already there. The mindscape, when they were both there consciously for the first time, was warm in the way that old buildings hold warmth. Not from any current source of heat, but from the accumulated memory of warmth. Candlelight, though the candles were not visible, stone walls that suggested age without announcing it. The ceiling was high enough that its upper extent was unclear, which Hermione found she did not mind. The books covered every surface. Her books were organized by subject, then chronology within subject, then by the specific weight she assigned each text based on its citation frequency and subsequent scholarship. This was the only rational system. She had maintained the system since the age of 7 and saw no reason to revisit it. Harry's books, and she registered them with a specific jolt of something that was not quite surprise but adjacent to it, were organized entirely differently, not alphabetically, not chronologically, by proximity to the moment they would be needed. She stood in front of one of his shelves for a moment. That's not a system, she said. It works, Harry said. He was examining her shelves with the expression of someone encountering a filing method that is technically functional but personally baffling. It works until you need something and you don't know when you're going to need it, at which point it fails completely. I always know roughly when I'm going to need something. That is not a thing people know. I know it. She turned to look at him. He was pulling a book from the third shelf of hers. Not randomly, she noted, but with the specific reach of someone who had already clocked its location, and turning it over in his hands. It was a secondary text on pre-ministry legal instruments. She had placed it in the third position because it was the third most cited source in the primary text. You put this one here because it's third most important, he said. Yes, I would have put it here because we need it in October. He slid it back onto the shelf, one position to the left of where she'd placed it. She moved it back. He watched her do this with the expression of someone who has decided, strategically, that this particular ground is not worth contesting. And then, she wasn't certain which of them started it first. They were both laughing, not loudly, not the kind of laughter that requires an audience or a performance, the quiet, involuntary kind that happens when something is absurd in a way that is also precisely right. And the laugh is really just the body's acknowledgement that it has registered this. It was the first time the mindscape had heard laughter. The bookshelves expanded slightly outward, as if making room for it. They began working in earnest the following week. Hermione had brought the notebook, not physically because nothing physical existed in the mindscape, but the contents of it, which she had committed to memory not through rote, but through the particular absorption that happened when she cared deeply about a subject. She laid the 14 legal consequences out in the space between the shelves, like a case map. Harry sat on the floor with his back against one of his shelves and read each one as she placed it. Sirius first, he said. She did not disagree. She had already reached the same conclusion, which was not a coincidence. Through the bond, his instinct had arrived at the same destination her analysis had, from opposite directions. She began drafting. The Wesengambot petition for a formal inquiry into the imprisonment of Sirius Orion Black required, under Statute 1214I, the signature of an emancipated lord of an ancient house with standing to demand proceedings. Harry had standing. The petition had to demonstrate three things: that the original imprisonment was procedurally void, that new evidence existed sufficient to warrant review, and that the petitioning lord had a defined interest in the outcome. She drafted the procedural void section first. It took 40 minutes in the mindscape, which corresponded in the physical world to Harry sitting very still in the Gryffindor common room and Hermione at her desk in the girls' dormitory, both of them present in a space that existed in neither location. When she finished the first section, Harry said, "The defined interest argument is going to be the hardest. I don't have a blood connection to Sirius. You don't need one." The statute uses the word interest, not relation. An interest can be established through documented correspondence, through named guardianship status, through, she paused, "He's your godfather." They'll say that's personal, not legal. It's both. We argue both. She was already writing. The personal argument supports the legal one. We don't lead with sentiment. We use it as corroborating evidence for the claim that he held a recognized protective role. "You write like a barrister," he said. "I've been reading like one for 6 weeks," she said. "It's the same skill." He said nothing to that. But in the mindscape, the space felt settled, and she had learned to read that as his version of agreement. Professor Dumbledore called her to his office on a Thursday. The invitation was delivered by Owl and worded with great warmth. He hoped she was settling in well. He had a few small questions about her academic progress. There was no urgency. Lemon drops would be provided. She spent 40 minutes preparing before she went. She sat in the mindscape alone. Harry was in defense class, a distant but present warmth at the edge of her awareness, and she mapped the conversation. She had 14 possible angles from which a headmaster might probe a third-year student who had recently made an unexpected inquiry to Gringotts. She constructed a response to each. The bond, she had discovered, generated a passive quality in the shared mental space between them. Not occlumency in the formal sense, which required years of dedicated practice to achieve proficiency, but something adjacent to it, a natural field that the Covenant produced around its parties. She had been learning to direct this field, to give it shape and specificity, rather than letting it sit formless. This was different from generating occlumency from nothing. She was not creating a shield. She was learning to aim one that was already there. The key was surface. Give him the surface he is looking for. Let the substance remain below it. She arrived at his office at 4 o'clock. The room was exactly what it had always been, circular, warm, full of the soft mechanical sounds of silver instruments doing things she had not yet catalogued. Fawkes was on his perch. Dumbledore was behind his desk with an expression of such genuine grandfatherly attentiveness that a less prepared person would have found it immediately reassuring. Hermione sat down and folded her hands in her lap. He asked about her coursework first. She answered accurately. He asked whether she was finding third year more demanding than she had expected. She said she found it appropriately challenging. He asked, with the same gentle, unhurried tone, whether she was enjoying the research aspects of her studies. He had heard from Madame Pince that she had been reading rather widely outside the curriculum. She said she had always been a broad reader. She said it the way a person states a fact that has been true long enough to require no defense. He paused. His eyes, she noted, had changed quality in a way she might not have caught 3 months ago. A very slight intensification of focus, a shift from the soft blue of engaged conversation to something marginally sharper. She felt it a half-second before it arrived. The legilimency was subtle. She would acknowledge that. It was not the battering-ram approach she had read about in the texts. It was a question almost, a gentle inquiry at the surface of her mind, the kind of thing that a person without the bond's passive field would register as nothing more than a sense that someone was listening closely. She registered it, she directed the field, the Covenant's own ambient protection, shaped and aimed, toward the surface layer reinforcing a single accessible plane that contained exactly one memory, herself at her desk in the girls' dormitory, alone reading. Standard textbook open. Nothing else. The memory was real. It had occurred on a Wednesday in October. It was accurate in every particular and utterly empty of everything he was looking for. She held it steady and continued speaking. She was saying something about the time Turner request she intended to submit for managing her expanded course load. She kept her voice even. She kept her hands folded. Dumbledore withdrew. The withdrawal took less than a second. His expression did not change. He was too accomplished for that. But there was a moment, very brief, very controlled, and yet undeniably present, in which something behind his eyes recalculated. She watched it happen without reacting. They finished the conversation pleasantly. He thanked her for coming. She thanked him for the lemon drops which she had not touched. She walked down the spiral staircase and out into the corridor and stood for a moment in the ordinary noise of a Thursday afternoon. Students moving between classes, someone laughing on the floor above. She took one slow breath. Then she opened her notebook and wrote, under the heading she had already prepared, D. Aware. Does not know what he is aware of. Proceed. She found Harry in the corridor outside the library that evening, standing very still with his eyes slightly unfocused, which Ron was watching from 3 feet away with the expression of someone who has seen this before and has been adding it to a growing total. That thing again, Ron said when she approached. What thing? She said. He gestured at Harry, the staring, the not being entirely here thing. He does it. You do it. Not always at the same time, but sometimes at the same time, which is the part that's starting to make me feel like I'm missing something significant. Harry came back. The return was gradual, a refocusing the particular quality of a person's attention returning to the room from wherever it had been. We share a mind space, he said. He said it the way he had decided to say it, she understood, directly, without softening, because Ron would find the softened version more unsettling than the plain one. Ron was quiet, not briefly quiet, substantially quiet. The kind of quiet that indicated a large volume of internal processing occurring at normal speed. A mind space, he repeated. A shared space. We can meet there, think through things. Both of you, yes. While you're also here, yes. Ron looked at Hermione. She met his eyes and did not add anything, because Harry had said it correctly and additions would dilute it. Right, Ron said at length. He appeared to be performing some kind of structural acceptance of information that had arrived in an unfamiliar shape. Right? Okay. He picked up his bag from where he'd set it against the wall. Is there anything in there I should know about, or is it? It's ours, Harry said, not unkindly, just exactly. Ron nodded, once, slowly. He walked toward the library without saying anything else. At the door he paused. Dumbledore's been asking around, he said, without turning. I heard him asking Professor Lupin about you too, about whether he'd noticed anything unusual. He pushed through the door. The corridor settled back into its ordinary sounds. Hermione looked at Harry. He looked at her. In the mindscape, which they were both faintly simultaneously aware of, the books on her shelves held their positions. His were already in the order they needed to be for October. She opened her notebook to the page that read, D. Aware, and underlined it once, cleanly. The petition was 11 pages. Hermione had written the first 8. Harry had written the last 3, which was not something either of them had planned. It had happened in the mindscape on a Sunday in February, when she had placed the draft in front of him, expecting to finish it herself, and found that he already knew what the last section needed to say. Not the legal architecture. Something under it. Something that described, in language she recognized as his because it moved differently than hers, what Sirius Black had been to James Potter, and therefore what the absence of him had cost. She had read his 3 pages without comment. Then she had added 2 citations that made the argument legally operable and filed the document. The Gringotts courier service did not use owls. It used a sealed parchment system routed through the bank's own internal channels. Goblin carried, goblin stamped, delivered directly to the recipient's registered address, with a notation that could not be intercepted, lost, or delayed by any ministry mechanism because it did not pass through any ministry mechanism. The Wesengate clerk's office received Lord Potter's formal petition for inquiry into the imprisonment of Sirius Orion Black at 7:43 on a Monday morning in March. Dumbledore received his notification copy, which the Ragnuk Accords required be sent simultaneously to any party with documented prior interest in the subject. At 7:43 on a Monday morning in March, Harry received confirmation of delivery at 7:44. He was eating breakfast when Hermione slid the confirmation receipt across the table. He read it, he set it down, he finished his toast. Ron watched all of this and said nothing, which had become, over the past several months, his most reliable contribution to mornings. She had found Pettigrew in the research, not the man himself, not yet, but the gap where a man should have been. She had been mapping animagus registration law since November, cross-referencing the ministry's published registry against every named individual in the documented history of the Marauders, which Lupin, who was careful but not careful enough, she had decided around a student who was reading his silences as closely as his words, had partially disclosed during a defense class discussion of the First War. 4 names, 1 dead, 1 imprisoned, 1 living quietly with his werewolf's burden, and 1 that the official record said had died on a Muggle street in East London in November 1981 and had never been registered as an animagus because there was no such registration. Peter Pettigrew, unregistered, presumed dead. She had written the words presumed dead in her notebook with 2 lines under them and stared at them for a long time. A week later she had found the registration record for a rat named Scabbers that had been in the Weasley family for 12 years, which was 9 years longer than the expected lifespan of a common rat, and she had set down her pen and sat very still in the library until the thought completed itself. She had told Harry that night in the mindscape. He had listened without moving. Then he had said, "I know." They had not discussed what it meant for Ron to have been sleeping in a dormitory with his family's betrayer for 2 years, because neither of them had language adequate to that particular fact, and so they had set it aside and continued building the case. Hermione had been tracking Scabbers for 3 days when the convergence happened. She had noticed, through the bond's extended peripheral awareness, the specific distress signature of a small animal attempting multiple escapes. Not hunger, not discomfort, but the particular frenetic energy of something that has understood it is running out of time. Scabbers had been trying to leave Ron's possession since Tuesday. Ron, attributing it to Crookshanks, had been holding the rat with increasing vigilance. Sirius arrived at the castle grounds on a Wednesday evening in dog form, which Hermione had also tracked. The bond's sensitivity to magical creatures had sharpened since October, and a registered animagus moving through Hogwarts grounds produced a signature distinct from either an ordinary dog or a wild animal. She had identified it the moment it crossed the perimeter. She had gone to Harry immediately. "Sirius is here," she said. "He's following Scabbers." "Ron is following Scabbers. If we don't intercept them, they'll converge at the Homping Willow in approximately 20 minutes without any of the information they need to survive the next hour." They ran. The shrieking shack smelled of old wood and longer old grief, the accumulated particular misery of a building that had been constructed for suffering and had never been asked to hold anything else. They found Sirius in the upper room, in human form now, and Lupin arriving moments later through the passage, and Ron standing in the doorway with Scabbers gripped in both hands, with the focused desperation of someone who had just watched their childhood pet attempt 4 separate escapes in 90 seconds. Sirius looked at Harry. Harry looked at him. There was a moment between them that Hermione observed and did not enter. It lasted, perhaps, 4 seconds. It was not a reunion, exactly, because they had not known each other. Harry had no memory of being held at a year old, and Sirius had not seen him since. It was something adjacent to reunion, recognition without a prior meeting, two people acknowledging a debt that the years between them had accumulated without their consent. "You're James's," Sirius said. His voice was not what it should have been yet. It would get there. "You're absolutely James's, except for the eyes," Harry said. "I know, my mother's." Remus Lupin stood in the doorway. He had gone quite still in a way that was different from Sirius's stillness. Sirius was still from the particular control of a man managing a great deal of concurrent feeling with insufficient infrastructure. "You already knew," Lupin said, not to Sirius, to Hermione. "For approximately 4 months," she said, about Peter. When he opened them, his expression had done the thing that grief does when it passes through shock and arrives on the other side, at something that has been waiting for a long time to be confirmed. "Where is he asked. "Ron has him," Harry said. Ron had not been told in advance. This was the only part of the plan Hermione had genuine reservations about, and she had documented those reservations in the mindscape before proceeding, because she believed in recording her doubts with the same rigor she applied to her conclusions. The argument for not telling him was purely operational. Ron's face did not conceal things, and Pettigrew, if he had spent 12 years hiding in plain sight, would recognize a warning in the set of someone's jaw. He had to be caught not knowing he was being watched. She had told Harry this, and Harry had sat with it for 3 days before he said, "He'll understand when it's over." And then, "He won't like that he will understand, but he will." This had turned out to be accurate. Ron handed the rat over without speaking. Lupin performed the reversal charm. It was not a composite cast. It didn't need to be. The magic of restoration required precision, not power, and Lupin's precision was considerable. Pettigrew came back into himself in stages, the way a body recalls a shape it has been avoiding, and the process was unpleasant to watch. He landed on the floor in a heap and looked up at the ring of faces above him, and immediately began to produce the particular variety of speech that was composed entirely of appeals and explanations, and the structural assumption that the correct level of desperation would eventually locate a sympathetic ear. Hermione had prepared for this. She and Harry stood together. She initiated and he completed. This was the pattern they had established in the mindscape over 6 weeks of careful composite practice. Not dramatic, but exact. One consciousness with 2 bodies and 2 wands, and what emerged between them was golden and old, and entirely without the color spectrum of any classified incantation. It settled over Pettigrew the way temperature settles over a room when something changes. Not a visible force, but a condition, a state. Pettigrew stopped speaking mid-sentence. Not silenced, he could speak. He simply could not, within the field of the truth-binding, make his mouth produce a statement that his body knew to be false. The distinction was important. Hermione had noted it in the research. It was not compulsion, it was consequence. He could try to lie. He would find it physically obstructed. "Your full name," Harry said. "Peter Pettigrew." The name came out of him like something extracted. "Were you secret keeper for the Potter family in October 1981? A long, writhing pause. Then, "Yes." "Did Sirius Black betray them to Voldemort?" The pause this time was shorter. Pettigrew's body had already done the calculation. "No." "Did you?" The word that followed was the smallest he had ever produced. It was incontestably true. It cost him something structural to say it, and he said it anyway because the binding gave him no alternative. "Yes." Sirius Black, standing in the doorway behind them, made no sound at all. The Wizengamot inquiry, with a truth-binding testimony filed through Gringotts' legal archive, took 3 weeks rather than the standard 3 months. The archive copy could not be suppressed or contested. It had been produced under composite covenant authority, which predated the Ministry's own evidentiary standards by 6 centuries. Dumbledore, who had arrived at the Shrieking Shack that evening and surveyed the situation with an expression Hermione catalogued as resigned recognition, submitted no counter-argument. There was no counter-argument available. Pettigrew was arrested and placed in Ministry holding facilities to await his own trial. Sirius Orion Black was exonerated on a Wednesday in April. He sat in the Wizengamot chamber for the reading of the decision and did not show anything on his face, which meant he was showing everything. Harry was in the gallery. They did not look at each other during the reading. They didn't need to. Cornelius Fudge had arrived at the Shrieking Shack 3 hours after the testimony was taken, accompanied by 2 Aurors and the specific kind of ministerial urgency that indicated a situation being actively managed before it became unmanageable. He found a bound Pettigrew. A freed Sirius Black under Lupin's calm supervision, Harry Potter sitting on the stairs with his arms folded, and Hermione Granger standing in the lower room with a notebook, who looked up when Fudge entered and said pleasantly, "The testimony has been filed with Gringotts' legal archive and transmitted to Wisengamot members Marchbanks, Bones, and Ogden. Copies are also held by Lord Potter's Covenant record. I mention this in the interest of transparency." Fudge looked at the Aurors. The Aurors looked at the walls. Fudge turned back to Hermione. He was a small man who had grown accustomed to situations that were smaller than him, and he was encountering, in the person of a 13-year-old girl with a notebook, a situation that was not. The adjustment was visible in the specific way he straightened his lime-green bowler, not with authority, but with the reflex of a man reaching for something familiar because the unfamiliar has become very large, very quickly. The testimony, he began, has been received by 3 Wisengamot members and the Gringotts archive, Hermione said, simultaneously under Ragnuk Accord filing protocol. If you have questions about the legal mechanism, I can recommend several texts, but the short version is that there is no procedure by which the evidence can now be suppressed, altered, or rendered inaccessible. It exists, it is witnessed, it will be present at the inquiry. She closed her notebook. Minister, the corridor smelled of old wood and the specific staleness of a building that had been sealed for years. The 2 Aurors had nothing to do with their hands. From somewhere above them came the sound of Sirius Black breathing. Just breathing, the ordinary involuntary act of a man who was, for the first time in 12 years, doing it freely. Fudge left without managing a full sentence. He had not been in control of the situation. He had walked into it already decided. The goblet of fire produced Harry's name first. The parchment cleared the blue-white flame in the standard way, crisped at the edges. The name burned into it in the same block lettering that had announced Cedric Diggory for Hogwarts, Fleur Delacour for Beauxbatons, Victor Crumb for Durmstrang. The great hall noise collapsed inward. People stood. Someone at the Gryffindor table started a sound that wasn't quite a cheer because the circumstances weren't quite right for one. A 14-year-old in age line, a binding magical contract nobody had asked him to sign. Professor Dumbledore was already moving toward the goblet. He did not take the parchment. He did not need to. He had read Harry's name, and what came next happened before he had completed the movement toward the front of the room, before the hall had fully processed the first announcement, before the sound could reconstitute itself into anything coherent. The goblet flared again, not blue-white this time. For 2 seconds, Hermione counted them seated at the Gryffindor table with her hands flat on the wood in front of her, already very still. The flame ran through a color that had no standard classification. Gold and silver, simultaneously. Ancient light in a room full of candles that had no business looking old. The second parchment cleared the flame. The hall was absolutely quiet. Dumbledore took this parchment too. He read it. His face, in the 3 seconds before he controlled it, passed through 4 distinct states. Hermione observed them in sequence and filed each one. First, recognition, the fast, involuntary kind that precedes processing. Second, a rapid assessment, multiple variables computed simultaneously. She could see the movement of it in the muscles around his eyes. Third, something that was not quite anger but occupied adjacent territory. And fourth, arriving last, settling in with the particular weight of a man accepting a situation he cannot alter. Resignation. He had known this was possible. He had hoped it wouldn't happen. Hermione Jean Granger, he said. His voice carried perfectly in the silence. Magical other. Nobody in the hall knew what that meant. Hermione did. She stood. The antechamber off the great hall was a small stone room that smelled of old smoke and the specific mineral quality of deep-cut Hogwarts walls. Cedric was already there when they arrived, leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed, and the expression of a person who has agreed to something very large and is now in the brief window between agreement and full comprehension of what he has agreed to. Fleur and Crumb arrived moments later, and then the adults, Dumbledore, McGonagall, Karkaroff, Madame Maxime, and then Ludo Bagman, who entered with the particular forward momentum of a man who expected the room to be a different shape than it was. Bagman stopped when he saw Hermione. He looked at Dumbledore. There are 5 of them. There are 5 champions, Dumbledore said. He said it with the tone of a man establishing a fact rather than announcing a surprise. The tournament has 3 schools. The cup selects 1 from each. There is a provision, Hermione said. She did not raise her voice. The room was not large. Article 7 of the Goblet's founding charter, drafted in 1294, predates the tournament's standardized three-school format by 60 years. It includes a category called Magical Other, defined as a witch or wizard who holds an active pre-ministry magical bond with an already selected champions and who cannot be separated from that champion's competitive standing without voiding the bond's protective terms. Bagman looked at her. He opened his mouth. The goblet is itself a pre-ministry instrument, she continued. It recognized the covenant. The selection was not an error. It was the instrument operating exactly as designed. Bartemius Crouch Sr. had entered the room quietly, as was his habit. He was a man who had learned that entering quietly meant arriving to more useful information than entering with announcement. He stood near the door with his hands clasped behind his back, and his face arranged in the specific bureaucratic neutrality that had served him through 20 years of ministry function. Ministry authority under the tournament's International Confederation guidelines, he said, permits the removal of any champion whose selection appears anomalous. Pending, the Confederation's guidelines postdate the Goblet's founding charter by 3 centuries, Harry said. He had not spoken yet in the room. When he spoke now, it was not loudly. It was with the quality that Hermione had observed developing in him over the past year, a kind of weight in the voice that was not volume, but something else, the sound of a person who has stopped needing the room's permission to be heard. The Goblet selected her under Article 7 of its own founding instrument. That instrument is pre-ministry. Under Wisengamot Statute 1692 IV, which I suspect you know, he said, looking at Crouch, a pre-ministry instrument supersedes all subsequent ministry or confederation legislation in matters within its own jurisdiction. The tournament is within the Goblet's jurisdiction. She stays. Crouch held his position for a moment. The room held its position with him. He unclasped his hands. He looked at Dumbledore. Dumbledore was examining a point somewhere above the cold fireplace with the focused attention of a man who has decided not to participate in this particular exchange. Crouch looked back at Harry. The selection stands, he said. In the mindscape that night, the library was very orderly. Hermione had the 4 tasks mapped before Harry arrived. Not the specific tasks, she did not have that information yet, but the range of possibilities, derived from the historical record of every Triwizard tournament between 1294 and the competition's suspension in 1792. Dragon handling had appeared in 4 of the 12 documented tournaments, water submersion challenges in 7, maze navigation in all 12. She had built contingency frameworks for each variation, weighted by historical frequency, cross-referenced against the likely capabilities of the other 3 champions. Harry sat down across from her and read what she had laid out. He was quiet for longer than usual. The maze, he said eventually. The center, whatever is at the center, is the point, not the maze. The maze tests navigation and defense. The center provides the final test. In every tournament, in 11 of 12 documented cases. What was the exception? 1492. The final task was a duel against a conjured opponent drawn from the champion's own memory. Harry was still for a moment. We need to train in opposition, not obstacle, opponent. She wrote it down. This was the first refinement. The second came 40 minutes later, when she had finished walking him through the water submersion framework. He had listened to the entire thing, then said, "The gillyweed plan fails if the task is in water we can't identify in advance. We need 2 approaches, and we run both until the last possible moment before committing to one." She had not said it because she wanted to understand whether he would reach it independently, which was information about the quality of his strategic instinct rather than a test she had designed with any kind of condescension. He reached it in 40 minutes. She noted this. "Complete," she said. He looked at her. "The contingency," she said. "It's complete with your modification. I was running it single track. You don't usually do that. I was moving fast. You slowed it down correctly." He said nothing. In the mindscape, the bookshelves sat in their respective arrangements, hers by subject, his by necessity, and the candlelight held steady, and the library existed in the quiet way it always did when they were working rather than in crisis. "Crumb watched you all through dinner," Harry said. "It was informational rather than anything else. I know, he's not performing, he's genuinely curious. I know that too." She paused. "You're not concerned. You find him interesting," Harry said. "I can feel that it's a clean thing, intellectual, like finding a good reference text." A brief pause. "I find it interesting that I can tell the difference." She considered this for a moment. The bond distinguishes quality of interest. Apparently, that's worth documenting. Everything is worth documenting to you. Most things, she said. Yes. Victor Crumb found her in the library 3 days later. He sat across from her without asking, which she noted as consistent with someone accustomed to being welcome wherever he chose to be. Not arrogance, simply the absence of the anxiety about space that most people carried. He looked at the book open in front of her. He read the title without commenting on it. He said, "You are the one who made Crouch back down. Lord Potter made Crouch back down." She said, "You gave him the words." She looked up. He was watching her with the particular attention of someone who is rarely surprised by people and is therefore carefully examining one of the exceptions. "I gave him the law," she said. "He already had the standing. This is a distinction you consider important." "Yes." Crumb nodded once. He opened his own book. They read in the same space for 2 hours and said very little else, which was its own kind of conversation, the kind that didn't require performance from either party. When he left, he said, "You are the most dangerous person in this tournament, including me." Hermione turned a page. "I know," she said. Rita Skeeter's article appeared in the Daily Prophet on a Friday, 6 days after the selection. It occupied the lower third of the front page beneath a photograph of Harry looking simultaneously famous and burdened. The article itself was, Hermione assessed, technically skilled. It deployed insinuation with the precision of someone who had long practice at placing poison in sentences without the sentence itself being legally actionable. The words dark enchantment appeared once. The phrase manipulative influence appeared twice. Hermione was described, across 4 paragraphs, as a girl of mysterious background and unusual power whose hold on Lord Potter Peverell bore the hallmarks of a compulsion bond. She read it once, she set it down, she went to the library. She was not looking for anything about Skeeter specifically. She was working from a detail she had registered during the first task. In the champion's holding area before they entered the arena, a beetle with an unusually regular marking pattern on its wing casings had settled briefly on her arm. The bond's ambient field had tagged the contact, the magical signature of a registered animagus form, the specific resonance of suppressed human consciousness inside an animal shape. She had noted it and filed it and known precisely where to look. The animagus registration records were public ministry documents. Cross-referencing them against the gap she had already identified, a journalist with inexplicable access to private conversations, present in locations that should have excluded press, took her 47 hours of library research. It was not difficult work, only painstaking. The pattern was exact. She filed the evidence package with the Gringotts Legal Archive on a Sunday evening. Pre-ministry covenant authority meant the filing was dated, witnessed, and irrevocable. On Monday morning, she sent one line to Rita Skeeter's professional address at the Prophet. "Publish one more word about me and the DMLE receives this file by owl post." Rita Skeeter published nothing about Hermione Granger for 7 months. She did not publish a retraction either, which Hermione had anticipated and found acceptable. The silence was the point. Not acknowledgement. Not apology. Simply the clean, functional absence of any further noise. She made a note in her legal archive index, filed it under precedents, suppression of false instrument, and returned to the tournament contingency framework. There were still 2 tasks she had not fully mapped. The announcement came through the stadium's sonorous amplification at 10:30, and the crowd that had been building noise for 40 minutes, the particular noise of 10,000 people anticipating spectacle, went quiet in stages. First, when Harry's name came through the horn, that was expected. That was the one they had come for, in the way the crowds always come partially for the famous name to say afterward that they were present when the famous name performed. Then Hermione's name came through, and the quality of the silence changed, because the crowd had spent weeks constructing an understanding of what today was. 3 champions, 3 schools, established format, known rules, and what they were hearing did not fit inside that construction, and so the noise collapsed under the weight of its own incompatibility with what was being announced. Magical other. The term moved through the stands in whispers that trailed off, because nobody had a referent for it and whispers require at minimum a shared assumption to complete themselves. They walked into the arena together. The enclosure was a wide circle of packed earth, the walls high enough to contain a panicked dragon, but not high enough to conceal one. The sky above was November-colored, pale gray, cold, moving fast with cloud cover that caught no warmth. The stands were full. The noise had not recovered. What remained was not silence exactly, but the negative of noise, the space where sound had been before something made the crowd recalibrate what it was watching. Something about the way they walked. She couldn't have told anyone precisely what it was. He couldn't either. It was not performance. They were not trying to create a particular impression. But the bond between them had been active for 16 months. And two people who share a consciousness do not move through space entirely independently. There was a synchrony to it that was below the level of deliberate coordination, the kind of thing that animals register before humans name it. The crowd registered it. They didn't have language for what they were registering. The noise stayed down. The horntail was at the far end of the enclosure. She was a Hungarian horntail, which was the designation the trainers used, which was a human category applied to something that considerably predated humans' capacity to categorize anything. She was 40 feet from nose to tail tip and covered in scales the color of dried blood, and she had been brought here under constraint, harness-bound, magically sedated to the minimum functional level, angry in the specific way that creatures of ancient lineage are angry when the terms of their existence have been altered without consultation. She saw them. She raised her head. She did not make the sound the crowd expected. She was quiet. They stopped 12 feet from each other, Harry and Hermione on one side, the horntail on the other, and in the stands 10,000 people held the collective breath of a crowd that has suddenly understood it is watching something for which it has no established response. Hermione initiated. It came from her left hand, not her wand hand, because the composite cast was not a wand spell and had never been. It was a frequency, a resonance produced at the point where two magical consciousnesses with a 17-month-old bond between them touched the same intention simultaneously, from opposite directions. Harry completed it from his right, the anchor, the will, the direction she had given it arriving at the destination he provided. What came between their hands was gold and silver. Not a beam, not a bolt, not anything the crowd had a word for. A field, perhaps if fields could be described as having weight and temperature, and the specific quality of something very old recognizing a medium through which it could move. It crossed the 12 feet of packed arena earth and reached the horntail without drama. Without impact. Not a collision, a contact. The dragon went still, not tranquilized. Her eyes were open and fully conscious. Not restrained, the harness had not been touched. She went still the way something goes still when it encounters a frequency it cannot place, and must, for the duration of its confusion, suspend its current activity to assess. She processed this for 3 seconds, then she sat down, not with any dignity particularly, and not with any of the movements of a controlled landing. She simply folded, the way something very large folds when the imperative to stand has been suspended, her haunches dropping first, and then her forelimbs, and then her head coming down to rest on the packed earth with a sound like a stone settling. The tail moved once, slowly. Then it stopped. The golden egg sat in the nest 8 feet behind her. Neither of them moved toward it immediately. Harry walked to the nest. He picked up the egg. He walked back. The entire arena was silent. The silence that followed was not the silence of stunned reaction, which has a specific quality, brief, breathless, already beginning to dissolve into noise as the crowd finds its footing. This silence was different. It was the silence of 10,000 people who had witnessed something they could not categorize and were therefore not yet certain how to respond. Nobody cheered. The horntail was still breathing. Her eyes tracked Harry as he crossed the arena with the egg, but she did not rise. She remained on the earth with the composure of something that had been shown a reason to wait, and was waiting. In the stands, the judges conferred, not in the usual way, not the quick discussion of people who have seen the thing and are agreeing on a number. They conferred for 4 minutes, which was 2 minutes longer than any scoring consultation in the tournament's modern history. Whatever they were saying, none of it was audible. Whatever they were deciding, they reached it slowly and without enthusiasm, which was not the reaction of people scoring a performance. It was the reaction of people recognizing that a category exists which their scoring rubric was not designed to accommodate, and making a decision about how to handle that anyway. All 10 scored at maximum. Simultaneously. Nobody explained the methodology. In the third row of the central stand, the man wearing Alastor Moody's face and carrying Alastor Moody's magical eye had stopped moving approximately 30 seconds into the composite cast. The eye tracked differently than it should have. The real Moody's magical eye was attuned to dark magic, to concealment, to curse signatures, to the specific register of harmful intent. Bartemius Crouch Jr. had been wearing it for 3 months and had learned its parameters reasonably well. What the eye showed him now was not dark magic. It showed him a resonance signature that he had read about in a single text, a restricted document in the Dark Lord's own library, written in 1693 by a Covenant scholar whose work the Dark Lord had acquired and studied and considered purely theoretical. Bonded pairs, pre-ministry instruments, the specific frequency produced by two magical consciousnesses operating as a unified casting mechanism. Not two wands, not two spells, one intention. He had been sent here to ensure Harry Potter entered the tournament and could be extracted at its conclusion. The plan was specific. It required a single champion at the center of the final task, and a port key, and a graveyard, and a ritual that the Dark Lord had been building toward for 11 months. The plan had assumed a single champion. He reached into his robes. The communication instrument he carried was not a standard ministry tool. It was older and considerably less detectable. He pressed his thumb to it and began composing his report. My lord, a development requiring immediate attention. The resonance signature of a bonded pair. Pre-ministry class, the girl is not incidental to his entry. She is constitutive of it. They cast composite. A live bond. The original extraction plan requires revision. Additionally, Pettigrew's release from ministry holding will need to be accelerated. Father can arrange the transfer before the Azkaban sentence is carried out. We will need him for the ritual. Awaiting your instruction. He pressed his thumb again. The message moved. He sat in the third row and watched the horntail breathe slowly on the packed arena earth and revised inside the architecture of the Dark Lord's plan every assumption that rested on a single point of failure. There were more than he had initially counted. Dumbledore found them in the champion's tent. His expression, when he entered, was one Hermione had not seen from him before, or rather she had seen its components separately but not assembled in this configuration. There was the resignation she had catalogued at the selection. There was something underneath it that she identified, after 2 seconds of consideration, as the specific frustration of a man whose concern for another person's safety is genuine, and whose ability to act on that concern has been systematically removed. He had something to say. She could see the shape of it forming in the way he breathed before speaking. She produced the document before he began. It was 4 pages, folded once, bearing the Gringotts seal at the base. She held it out. A formal notice, she said. Lord Potter will be addressing the Wizengamot at the next available session regarding the tournament's binding contract and the legal precedent established by the goblet's recognition of magical other status. The notice has already been filed with the clerk's office and the Gringotts archive. It is a matter of record. Dumbledore looked at the document. He looked at it for long enough that the silence in the tent became its own kind of statement. Cedric had already left. Fleur and Crumb were on the far side of the space, speaking quietly in their respective languages. Nobody was close enough to observe. He took the document. He did not open it. He already knew what was in it, or could deduce it, which for Dumbledore functioned as the same thing. The blue eyes behind the half-moon spectacles moved to Harry, then to Hermione, then to a point between them that she had learned to recognize as the place he looked when he was assessing the bond, rather than either of them individually. He said nothing. He folded the document once more, carefully, along its existing crease. He put it in his robes. He left the tent. Harry watched him go. Then he set the golden egg down on the bench beside him. It was heavier than it looked and had been warm since he picked it up, and whatever sound it produced when opened he had not yet tried to access. He was going to tell us we'd drawn too much attention, he said. Yes. And that power used visibly is power that makes targets of us. Something close to that. He's not wrong, Harry said. Hermione looked at the place where Dumbledore had stood. He's not wrong about the risk, she said. He's wrong about the conclusion. The alternative to drawing attention was to perform the task as individuals and suppress the bond's composite expression for the sake of appearing ordinary. We would have passed. We would have been safe from observation. She picked up her quill. And in the process we would have given the bond's self-suppression a precedent. Ancient magic notices when you tell it to be smaller than it is. I was not willing to establish that habit. Harry looked at her. That's why, he said. Not a question. That's part of why. She opened her notebook. The other part is that the Horntail was distressed. She had been transported under constraint across 2 countries in 4 days. What we used on her was not coercion. It was recognition. She wrote for a moment. She sat down, he said. She sat down, Hermione agreed, because we gave her a reason to. Outside, in the dimming November afternoon, 10,000 people were filing out of the stands with the particular quiet of crowds who have seen something they cannot yet describe to each other, and so are not yet trying. The port key was a Tri-Wizard cup. Harry understood what had happened in the 2 seconds between touching it and landing on cold ground in the dark, because Hermione had mapped this possibility, not this specific mechanism, but the category of it, the theoretical. If the final task contains a port key with a hostile destination, the extraction point will be isolated, and the timing will be the captor's choice, not yours. She had rated it low probability. She had built a contingency anyway, because low probability was not zero probability, and she did not work in zeros. The contingency assumed he would have his wand. He had his wand. The contingency had not assumed Cedric. He had no mechanism for that. Neither had she. Some things exist outside contingency frameworks, and a 17-year-old boy dying on cold grass with no warning and no reason that Harry could make sense of was one of them. He filed it the way you file a thing that is too large for immediate processing, into a compartment sealed until there is time and space and the absence of immediate threat. There was no absence of immediate threat. The graveyard was old. The headstones were worn smooth at their inscriptions, the names on them barely legible. A yew tree in the far corner, black against a sky with no moon. A figure was moving fast near an iron cauldron, preparing components with the focused efficiency of someone who has rehearsed this extensively and is performing it on pure mechanical memory. Not Pettigrew. Pettigrew was in Ministry Holding, awaiting his Azkaban sentence. Barty Crouch Jr. had sent a message to the Dark Lord in November, and the Dark Lord had sent instructions back, and Barty Crouch Sr., who had been operating under the Imperious Curse since the previous autumn, his son's particular cruelty, delivered through the nearest available instrument, had quietly arranged for the transfer paperwork to redirect Pettigrew from Azkaban processing to a location the official record described as a ministerial facility in Scotland. The paperwork was impeccable. The facility did not exist. Pettigrew had been with the Dark Lord since January, so it was Pettigrew who moved at the cauldron's edge, restored to his master's service. His absence from the Azkaban rolls a bureaucratic error that Hermione would spend 6 pages analyzing when Harry told her what he had seen. Harry was bound to a headstone before he had fully regained his feet. He assessed. Wand, gone. Pettigrew's attention divided between the cauldron and the need to be fast. The cauldron itself, large, iron, beginning to heat. Whatever was in it was already moving beneath the surface. The bindings were not standard rope. They had a magical component that tightened on resistance, so he stopped resisting. He held still and assessed. In his chest the bond was a cold still point. Hermione, far away, already awake in some way she was not entirely conscious of. He felt her register the change in him. Not the specific information, not the details she had no mechanism to receive, but the frequency of crisis, the specific signature of Harry under immediate physical threat, which felt different from Harry under general danger and different again from Harry in pain. The bond had learned these distinctions over 16 months. She was reading them now, wherever she was. He held still. He waited. The blade Pettigrew used was silver. Ritual instruments for workings of this class were traditionally silver. The old texts specified this, and the old texts had been followed exactly. The cut was precise. Inside the forearm, not deep enough to be immediately dangerous, deep enough to produce what the ritual required. Harry did not make a sound. He watched the blood fall, which was what you did when you had no other available action. You observed. And he saw it. He had no framework for it. He could not have explained it afterward with full accuracy, because his magical perception was not developed enough to name what he was seeing. It was like being able to hear a tone without knowing the instrument that produced it. In his blood, falling in the 3-second arc between his arm and the surface of the cauldron, there was something that was not blood. A thread, finer than a hair. Gold and silver simultaneously, which was not a color combination that blood achieved. It fell with the blood, but did not behave the same way. Where the blood dissolved into the dark liquid of the cauldron's surface, the thread did not dissolve. It moved instead, deliberately in the way that living things move rather than falling things, and it wound itself around the iron exterior of the cauldron in a single closed loop, and then went still. Harry looked at it. He had perhaps 2 seconds. Then Pettigrew was completing the ritual. The thing that rose from the cauldron was not the creature Harry remembered from the back of Quirrell's head. That had been vestigial, a form that borrowed its existence from someone else's body and was accordingly diminished. What emerged from the ritual was whole, the body rebuilt from the components of old bone, living flesh, unwilling blood. Tall, white, the features resolved themselves like a face remembered rather than constructed. Lord Voldemort stood in the graveyard and breathed for the first time in 13 years with a body that was entirely his own. He was still for a moment, taking inventory. His hands, his fingers, the specific weight of restored corporeality after more than a decade of parasitic half-existence. The Death Eaters arriving through the dark were already reacting, kneeling, the particular sound of robes on grass, the silence of people who are afraid even in the presence of what they worship, perhaps especially then. He paused, a fraction of a second, barely enough to register. Something in the interior of the new body was not wrong precisely, not painful. It was a quality like a taste that arrives at the edge of perception and does not correspond to anything you have eaten. An unfamiliar resonance. Something present that he had not put there. He attended to it for that fraction of a second. Then he dismissed it. The ritual had been complex. Pettigrew was unreliable. Whatever small impurity existed in the execution would resolve itself in time, and there were considerably more pressing matters. The boy on the headstone, the Death Eaters to be addressed, the beginning of the work that had been interrupted 13 years ago. He turned toward Harry and began. This was the story's most important beat. He dismissed it. 200 miles away, in a bedroom in Hampstead, every book on Hermione Granger's shelves lifted 3 inches off their surfaces simultaneously and dropped. Not in the mindscape. In the physical room. Books she had placed carefully, books she had organized by subject and citation frequency, and the accumulated logic of 3 years of magical scholarship, displaced from their positions by a force she did not consciously produce. She was already sitting up. She had been sitting up since the moment the portkey activated, because the bond had transmitted the signature of crisis with enough clarity that sleep had become involuntary. She did not panic. She picked up the nearest book from the floor. She set it on her desk. She opened her notebook. She wrote, H taken. Portkey destination unknown. Bond active and stable. He is not incapacitated. Wand status unknown. Threat level high. He is being held rather than immediately harmed. A pause. Ritual preparation. The binding contract for the tournament required his participation. Someone has been building toward this. Pettigrew's extraction from ministry custody, Crouch Sr., under Imperius as suspected. The ritual is proceeding. She wrote for the next 20 minutes without stopping. Not everything she wrote was certain. She marked uncertainties with a small bracket and a question mark and moved past them, because certainty was not the prerequisite for building a model. A model required only the available data and a willingness to hold provisional conclusions at arm's length until they were confirmed or disproved. When she felt Harry escape, felt was not precisely the right word, but there was no right word for what the bond transmitted at that distance during a crisis. It came through as a release of pressure, not safety, not yet, but the removal of a specific imminent weight. He was moving. He had the initiative. She turned to a clean page. She wrote at the top, Soul Ward Activation Hypothesis. By the time Harry crossed back into British soil, she had 6 pages. He told her everything the following morning in the Mindscape, which was the first private space available to them. The library was disordered, books displaced from both sets of shelves, some on the floor, the candlelight less steady than its baseline. It would correct itself when the crisis had fully processed. It always did. He described the thread in his blood in careful detail, the way she had taught him to describe magical observations, what it looked like, how it moved, what it did. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she had already written 3 more pages to add to her 6. You were right that it wound around the cauldron, she said. I think it continued past the cauldron, into him, into the ritual's output, which is him, yes. Harry sat against one of his bookshelves. What does that mean? The Soul Ward, she said. I've been mapping its behavior. Every documented account I can find of a blood covenant's defensive mechanism describes the same mechanism. It doesn't prevent hostile contact with the bond's parties. It tags hostile contact, it marks what enters and attaches a resonance signature to it that the entering element then carries back out. So when my blood went into the ritual, the ward's signature went with it, into the cauldron, into the body it produced. She set down her pen. He has a piece of our bond's resonance inside him now, a frequency his fragmented soul has no mechanism to process, because his soul is built on division and the covenant is built on the opposite. It won't kill him immediately, it won't feel immediately wrong to him, but it is there, and it will worsen, and he does not know what he's carrying. He paused, Harry said. When he rose, just for a second, like something was slightly off. And he dismissed it. Yes, Hermione looked at her notebook, the 6 pages and the additional 3 and whatever she had been building in the hours since the graveyard. Good, she said. The word was not cruel. It was the specific satisfaction of a prediction confirmed. Then he does not know. Dumbledore's office was, as it had always been, circular, silver instruments, Fawkes, the portraits. He had called them in on the second day. He listened to Harry's account of the graveyard, with his hands folded and his face arranged in the careful attention of a man who is simultaneously receiving information and managing his response to it. When Harry finished, Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. Hermione placed the document on his desk before he spoke. It was 12 pages. The Gringotts seal was on the cover page, which meant it had been filed with the legal archive before this meeting. She had filed it last night, which meant she had known before entering this room what ground the conversation would cover and had prepared accordingly. Dumbledore looked at the cover. He looked at the seal. "I'd like you to read this before we discuss the ritual's implications," she said. "Particularly pages 8 through 10. They describe something I believe you will recognize." He opened the first page. She said nothing. Harry said nothing. They sat in the 2 chairs across from his desk and waited, and the silver instruments made their small mechanical sounds. And Fawkes turned his head and regarded the document with the mild interest of a creature that had watched a very large number of significant moments pass through this room and had learned to recognize their shape. Dumbledore read. He read pages 8 through 10 twice. When he reached the section on soul ward contamination, on the specific mechanism by which a bonded pair's defensive resonance could tag and poison a hostile magical intrusion, following it back to its source, he set the pages down carefully. He looked at Hermione. He looked at the space between her and Harry. He said very quietly, "There is something else you should know, something I have been not yet ready to tell you." He paused, the soul fragment in Harry's scar. "I had hoped you might not reach this conclusion independently. You have." "Page 11, Hermione said. "The soul ward analysis arrives at the scar as the ward's primary receptor. The fragment is what the ward was protecting around. I deduced it before I filed this." She held his gaze. "I'm asking you to confirm it." Dumbledore looked at Harry. "You carry a piece of Voldemort's soul," he said. He said it as a man who has been back to the edge of a thing and has decided that a rival, however forced, is still a rival since the night he tried to kill you. The connection, the scar, is a Horcrux. Unintentional, but present. Harry was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "You?" "Hermione told me this morning, after she filed the 12 pages. He looked at Dumbledore with the particular steadiness that the bond had been building in him for 2 years. "What I need to know is whether your plan required me to die to destroy it." The silence was very long. "It was one possibility I had been considering," Dumbledore said at last. "Not a certainty, not a plan I had finalized, but a possibility, yes." He looked at Hermione. She was already writing. "We'll find another way," she said without looking up. "We always do." Dumbledore read the remaining pages in silence. He could not refute a single citation. He heard them through a wall, not through thin plaster, through the solid Victorian brickwork of the second-floor hallway at number 12, Grimmauld Place, which should have been sufficient insulation against anything short of a sonorous charm. But the bond, at its current development, produced something that was not quite sound and not quite thought, and Ron Weasley had been living in proximity to it for long enough that he had, without realizing or intending to, developed a sensitivity to its frequency. He stopped walking. The words through the wall were Harry's and Hermione's in alternation, but they were not having 2 separate sides of an argument. They were finishing each other's premises. Hermione would begin a strategic observation, and Harry would complete its operational implication before she reached it, and she would move on to the next premise without acknowledging the completion because acknowledgement was redundant. The completion was expected. It was part of the method. Back and forth, 3 exchanges, each one building on the last, and the entire architecture constructed in 90 seconds would have taken either of them 15 minutes to reach alone. Ron stood in the hallway and counted the exchanges and understood something that he had been not understanding for 2 years. It was not a conversation that had started in that room. The conversation had started in the summer before 3rd year. It had been running, continuously, in a space he could not enter, and what he was hearing through the wall was not a discussion. It was the surface expression of an argument that had already been resolved inside the bond, and was being spoken aloud for the sake of the record. The conclusion had been reached before the words began. He stood there for a moment longer. Then he went downstairs and sat in the kitchen and did not say anything to anyone for 20 minutes, which was unusual enough that Fred noticed and said nothing, which was unusual enough that George noticed, and neither of them said anything either, which meant all three Weasley brothers were sitting in the kitchen being quiet, which had not happened since their grandmother's funeral. He found Harry alone the following evening. The room was one of the smaller ones on the third floor, barely furnished, a single window overlooking the square. Harry was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall in the way he sat when he was thinking rather than resting, and he looked up when Ron came in with the specific attention of someone who had been expecting this. Ron sat down on the floor across from him. "You don't need me anymore," he said. He had decided to say it plainly, without the cushioning that would make it easier to say but less honest. "You haven't. For years." Harry was quiet. Not evasive, genuinely quiet, which was different. He was considering the question with the same seriousness he had learned to bring to anything that was actually serious, and Ron found he was more unsettled by that than he would have been by a quick denial. "I need you," Harry said finally. "I just can't explain how, the same way I could before." The sentence sat between them. It was the most honest thing Harry could have said, which meant it was also insufficient, and neither of them pretended otherwise. This was the particular cruelty of an honest answer that cannot be completed. It did not deny what Ron was feeling. It confirmed that what Ron was feeling was accurate. It offered nothing in exchange. "That's not enough," Ron said. "No," Harry agreed. "It's not." They sat with that for a while. The room was cold. Grimmauld Place was always cold on the upper floors, a chill that came from the walls rather than the temperature, from decades of magic and misery having been stored in the plaster until they became a condition of the building itself. "I'm not—" Ron stopped. "Started again. It's not about them, you and her. It's not that I don't care about that. I'm not some jealous." He stopped again. "It's that you are already what I'm trying to become. Both of you. You walked in there already and I'm still outside trying to figure out which door to use." Harry looked at him. "Ron," he said. "Don't." He said it without heat. "Don't manage it. I'm not asking you to fix it. I just needed to say it where it could be heard." Harry nodded. He did not try to fix it. They sat in the cold room for a while longer, without speaking, which was its own answer to something. Sirius found Ron on the stairs the next morning. Not by accident. Nothing Sirius did in his own house was entirely by accident, even if he wanted you to think it was. He sat on the step below Ron. He always chose a position slightly lower than the person he was talking to when the person was younger, which Ron had noticed and which he suspected was deliberate, and produced 2 mugs of tea that were slightly too hot, which also felt deliberate. Ron took one. "You watched it happen with my dad," Ron said. He was not asking. Sirius drank his tea. "Started in 6th year. James and your dad were the same. Genuinely the same. Interchangeable in every way that mattered. Until the year James fell for Lily and everything shifted." He paused. "She was brilliant. Lily, not in the showy kind of way, in the way where you realize, gradually, that the conversation you're in has been happening at a level below the one you can hear, and they've been having it the whole time, and you can almost follow it, but not quite. Then I decided something." He set down his mug on the step. "I decided that being the one they trusted with their secrets was different from being the one who kept them. That's not lesser. That's a different function. James and Lily needed Sirius Black to be the person who stayed external, who wasn't in it, because you can't see the shape of something from inside it." He glanced at Ron. "Your value to them is partly that you're not in the bond. The bond has limits. It can't see itself from outside. You can." Ron was quiet for a moment. "That's a very reasonable thing to say," he said. "I don't entirely believe it yet." "No," Sirius said. "You will, though, when you find what you're for." He picked up his mug. He went back downstairs without pressing the point, because pressing a point was not what that conversation needed. And Sirius, at 36 and having spent 12 years with nothing but his own thoughts for company, had learned the difference between a thing that needed to be pressed and a thing that needed to be left to finish on its own. Ron sat on the stairs with his too-hot tea and turned it over. "A guardian," Sirius had said. Not an afterthought. A function. He was not convinced. But he kept the word. He put it somewhere useful. Dolores Umbridge's educational decrees arrived at Hogwarts in September, and she brought with her the specific administrative malice of a person who has been given authority over a population she has long considered problematic and is thoroughly enjoying the correction process. The first decree to target Harry and Hermione specifically came in October. It was framed generally, a prohibition on student organizations meeting without ministry-approved faculty supervision. But its intent was evident to anyone who had been watching the castle's political architecture for more than a fortnight. Hermione read the decree posted outside the Great Hall and turned to Harry. "She cannot legally apply this to us," she said. "The Covenant's pre-ministry status exempts our communications and joint activities from ministry educational oversight. This is documented. She'll learn." Hermione looked at the decree for another moment. "In the meantime, we need someone she isn't watching." They both looked at Ron. Ron said, "I'm not in your bond." "No," Hermione said. "She doesn't have a file on me. She's focused on you too, and the DA leadership, and anyone who is at the ministry." Also correct. He looked at Hermione's expression, which was not asking him for a favor. It was offering him something useful to do, which was a different thing, and she was precise enough in her language of intention that the difference was clear. "What do you need?" he said. He proved, over the following 3 months, to be extraordinarily effective. The invisibility was the instrument. Not physical invisibility, but the specific unnoticeability of someone who was not in the bond, not in the Covenant's legal record, not in Umbridge's growing file of threats and persons of interest. He moved through the castle without the particular gravity that Harry and Hermione now generated simply by being in a room, and he used this the way you use a passage that others don't know exists. He carried messages, he identified informants, he documented Umbridge's own educational violations in a log he kept in a cipher Hermione had taught him in October, which he had learned in 3 days because the motivation of purpose was a more effective teacher than curiosity had ever been. He was not in the bond. He was beginning to understand what he was. The detention summons came on a Wednesday. Harry had said in Umbridge's defense class that Voldemort had a physical body, had used that body to kill, and would use it again. This was the truth, which was not a defense Umbridge's educational regime recognized as relevant. The blood quill was on her desk when he entered. She indicated the parchment beside it with the brisk efficiency of someone who has conducted this particular transaction many times and expects the variables to be the same. He looked at the quill. He looked at the parchment. He held up his left hand. It was not a dramatic gesture. He simply raised it, palm outward, at a level where it was visible in the room's lamplight. And on the back of his left hand, faint in ordinary light but present in the particular way that a thread of gold-silver is present when it has been woven through a person for 2 years and is beginning to make itself part of the surface. The Covenant's mark was briefly, completely visible, not glowing, not performing itself, simply there, the way a scar is there, a record of something that had already happened and would not unhappen. He said, very quietly, "I am Lord Potter of an ancient house. This decree has no legal authority over me." He left. She did not move from behind her desk, not because she had no authority. She believed genuinely that she had enormous authority. But the Covenant thread on his hand, brief as the sight had been, had produced in her the specific paralysis of a person who has encountered a category they were not trained to handle. And the instinctive administrative response to an unrecognized category was a momentary stillness, while the appropriate box was located. No appropriate box existed. The door closed behind him. In the corridor, he passed Ron at the corner of the stairwell, who had been outside the door for the last 4 minutes with a parchment and a quill of his own, documenting the duration and terms of the illegal detention attempt in the cipher that Hermione had taught him in October. Ron looked at Harry, then at the closed door, then back. "She didn't stop you," he said. "No." Ron wrote something on the parchment and folded it into his robes. He would file it with the legal archive at Gringotts on Saturday, which was when nobody was watching him. He walked toward the stairs without waiting, because there was somewhere he needed to be. Harry had the vision on a Thursday. He came out of it at 3 a.m. with his scar burning and Sirius's face still printed on the inside of his eyelids. The stone floor, the dark corridor, the Department of Mysteries, the specific quality of suffering that the vision transmitted with the fidelity of something designed to be convincing. He sat up. He reached for the bond. Hermione was already there. She had been in the mindscape for an indeterminate period before he arrived. The library's candlelight was steady, which meant she had been calm long enough for the space to reflect it, and she had 3 pages of notes already set out on the central table. She had felt the vision start, she said. She had used the time. "It's a trap," she said without preamble. He looked at her notes. "The corridor you saw, it corresponds exactly to the layout of the Department of Mysteries' eastern access point, which is not publicly documented, but which I found in a decommissioned ministry architectural survey from 1962 that the Hogwarts library acquired as a legal deposit and has not catalogued. She turned a page. The trap requires you to go there believing Sirius is in danger. The Death Eaters will be waiting. Whoever arranged this knows you well enough to know that you would go. Sirius isn't there. Sirius is at Grimmauld Place. I confirmed through the bond's secondary sensitivity 20 minutes ago. He's sleeping, which I can verify because his general state comes through to me as a background frequency when he's in physical proximity to you during extended periods, and he's been at Grimmauld for 3 days. Harry looked at the notes, then at her. "We're still going," he said. She turned another page. "Yes," she said, "but not for him." She had been building the Hall of Prophecy argument since October. The hall itself was a pre-ministry repository. This was established in the 1962 architectural survey and confirmed by 2 secondary references she had found in restricted Hogwarts texts. The recording spheres it contained were instruments of ancient standing, governed not by ministry archival law but by the same foundational charter as the Wiesengamot, which meant that a pre-ministry instrument of sufficient seniority and active legal standing, the primordial covenant for instance, could, under the founding charter's amendment provisions, append a clause to any act of prophecy binding, not erase it, not void it, amend it, change who bore the obligation. The distinction was important. Erasing a prophecy's binding would require an act of magic she rated as theoretically possible and practically catastrophic in its side effects. Amending it required only that the amending instrument hold higher seniority, which the Covenant at 3 centuries of active standing did, and that the amending parties be the subjects of the prophecy, which the Covenant's own recognition of Harry as Lord Potter Peverell and herself as Lady Dagworth-Granger had established in a legal sense since September 1993. She had the amendment language drafted in November. She had been waiting for access. They told the DA on a Friday evening, not the full plan. Enough of it. Ron she told fully, because Ron had a right to the full version, and because she had learned from 8 months of watching him operate that partial information was wasted on someone who was going to fill in the gaps with correct inferences anyway. She said, "We are going to the Department of Mysteries deliberately. We know it is a trap. The Death Eaters will come. Your job, all of you, is to hold the corridor while Harry and I complete the amendment in the hall. Not to fight them to victory, to hold them long enough. 12 minutes, possibly 15. He absorbed this. What happens if we can't hold them that long? Then they reach the hall before the amendment is sealed, and they will attempt to retrieve the prophecy sphere, and we will manage that complication as it arises." He looked at the others, Neville, Luna, Ginny, the assembled DA, and something in his face had the quality she had seen developing since August, the particular steadiness of a person who has found the shape of their usefulness and is operating within it. "We can hold 15 minutes, he said. She believed him. The ministry at midnight was a different institution than the one that existed during the day. The atrium empty, the lifts running on their automated cycles, the corridors below the visitor level lit with the reduced maintenance illumination of a building that was functioning rather than operating. They moved through it without being seen, because Hermione had mapped the security rotation in March from a document that was technically public record and practically inaccessible to anyone without the patience to locate it in a 40-year-old filing index. The Department of Mysteries received them in silence. The outer corridor, the circular room with its many doors, she counted to the correct one, the 4th on the left after the entrance, which the 1962 survey had designated the Hall of Prophecy's access point, and they entered. The hall was immense. The rows of shelves extended to a height that implied a ceiling existed somewhere above the ambient darkness, though it was not visible. The recording spheres sat in their numbered positions, each one its own small light source, a room full of captured futures organized by the same indifferent bureaucracy that filed everything else. The air was cold and had the specific quality of spaces that had been sealed for long periods, not stale, but finished, as if the air itself had been there long enough to become something other than air. She found row 97, position 26. The sphere was smaller than she expected, the size of a large plum. It rotated slowly in its holder with the autonomy of something that had been moving for 15 years and had no reason to stop. Inside it, a recorded figure moved her mouth in the loop of a prediction that had already changed the shape of several lives. Harry reached for it. She stopped him. "Listen first," she said. He took it down. The recorded voice emerged, as it would for the subject of the prophecy. Trelawney's voice, distant and formal, stripped of the usual theatrical affectation. speaking in the specific register that recorded prophecy used, the one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches, born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies, and the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal. Harry listened to the end. He set it down. He looked at Hermione. "We already knew the shape of it," she said. "Now we know the words." She placed her hands on either side of the spear's holder. "The words are wrong," she said. "Not wrong as in false, wrong as in incomplete. The prophecy had been made about a singular subject in a time before the Covenant had activated. It had been accurate when made, it was no longer accurate about who bore the obligation." She and Harry stood on either side of the holder. The composite cast was not a dramatic thing. It had never been. It was a frequency, his will, her method, converging at the same point. The gold-silver emerged between their hands and settled over the sphere, not as light but as a condition, the way the Covenant itself was a condition rather than an object. She felt it engaging with the sphere's ancient recording mechanism. Two very old systems recognizing each other's authority, two pre-ministry instruments in the first contact of a legal conversation. She spoke the amendment in the formal language of the founding charter. Where the prophecy said, "the one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord," the Covenant heard it and recorded beside it in the sphere's own substance, the sovereign pair with the power to unmake him. Not vanquish, unmake. The sphere accepted the amendment. She felt it close around the addition the way a document closes around a final signature. Complete, sealed, irrevocable. Behind them, from the corridor, she heard the first sounds of the Death Eaters. The DA held. She could feel Ron through the extended peripheral awareness the bond granted during crisis. Not his specific thoughts, but his general state, the signature of someone operating under pressure and holding their position. It was steady. It stayed steady for 11 minutes, which was most of what they needed. Then the Death Eaters broke through. The brain room was not where anyone wanted to be in a combat situation. The creatures in the tanks were not aggressive by nature, but the fight had disturbed the water, and what came through the tank's shattered glass in the confusion of 6 simultaneous curses and 3 counter-hexes was not 1 brain but 4, and the tentacles they produced moved with the purposeful speed of something that had been waiting for the temperature of the room to change. Ron went down. He did not make a sound when it happened, which was its own kind of severity. The brain's tendril caught his shoulder, and the look on his face was not pain exactly. It was the specific shock of something attaching to you that you cannot identify and cannot process. He hit the floor. He was breathing. The tendril was still there. Harry's response was not a decision. Hermione felt it through the bond as a wall of heat, not metaphorical heat, but the specific temperature of rage in its purest concentrated form. The rage of someone watching the person they cannot afford to lose be hurt in front of them with no available immediate mechanism for prevention. It was enormous, and it was entirely without shape. She gave it a shape. She took the rage the bond was carrying from his side to hers, and she fed it into the composite cast the way you feed current into a circuit, not containing it, directing it. The gold-silver that emerged was not the same frequency as their standard composite. It was the standard frequency at a pressure that the standard frequency did not normally reach, and what it produced when it cleared the room was not a blast, and not a shield, and not any classified incantation. It was a pulse. One pulse. It moved outward from the point between their hands, and when it reached the brain tentacles they released, and when it reached the remaining Death Eaters in the room they staggered, and when it reached the walls the stone groaned with the specific sound of very old things being subjected to forces they were not designed for. The room was clear. Ron was already trying to sit up. She let Harry go to him. Lucius Malfoy arrived at the Hall of Prophecy 3 minutes after the amendment was sealed. He was not disheveled. Whatever had happened in the corridor had not reached him. He moved through the rows of shelves with the particular confidence of a man who believes the architecture of the world has been arranged for his convenience, and he located row 97, position 26, with a speed that indicated prior knowledge of its exact location. He reached for the sphere. He got it 2 inches from the holder. The burn was immediate and thorough, not the burn of heat, but of contact with a surface that had been sealed against hostile magical intent by an instrument considerably older than his bloodline's documented history. He withdrew his hand. The mark it left was not a wound exactly. It was an impression, a specific pattern of gold-silver scored into his palm that would not fade, because the Covenant did not make temporary marks on things that reached for what it protected. He looked at his hand. He looked at the sphere, still rotating in its holder, amended and sealed, entirely unretrievable. Hermione stepped out from between 2 shelves 12 feet away. She was holding her notebook. She had been holding it since the amendment sealed, because what happened next was always going to produce documentation. "The covenant notes your attempt," she said. Her voice was the same register it used for everything, precise, sufficient, not raised above what the space required. "It will be cited at your asset hearing." She turned and walked back toward the corridor where the others were. The sphere rotated in its holder behind her. The amended words sat inside it beside the original, sealed in pre-ministry authority, permanent in the specific way of things that do not require anyone's continued agreement to remain true. Row 97, position 26. The sovereign pair with the power to unmake him. Not one, two. It had always needed to be two. He found it in Borgin and Burke's inventory records. Not the locket itself, the record of its sale. He had been working the Hogwarts operative network for 8 months by then, running information between sympathetic staff and the legal archive, tracking the movement of dark objects through channels that the Death Eater-adjacent students used under the assumption that nobody was watching them. This assumption was incorrect. Ron Weasley was watching them, specifically because he was not bonded, not notable, not in anyone's file-marked threat, and had learned in the preceding 2 years that invisibility was a more effective intelligence tool than any magic he could name. The inventory record was a copy, acquired through a contact he would not specify even in Hermione's cipher, because some sources required absolute protection. It listed, among other modified instruments, 1 locket, antique gold, serpent motif, interior mechanism replaced. Specialist modification, proximity-triggered soul-severing delivery. Target, bonded pairs. Range, 4 feet. Commission, anonymous, payment in full, collected October. He sat with the document for a long time. He had read about soul-severing weapons in Hermione's research notes. Not because she had shown him, she hadn't. He had been reading her notes without telling anyone since 3rd year, beginning in the period when he had understood that the conversation between Harry and Hermione was 2 years old and contained things he had not been present for. He had not read them to catch up. He had read them the way you read a navigation chart when you're not the one steering, but you want to understand the water. He had read everything she wrote. He had filed it. He had told no one. On page 47 of the Covenant research notes, in the autumn of 5th year, she had written a theoretical section on anti-Covenant weapons. She had written it because she believed in knowing the vulnerabilities of any instrument she relied upon. She had described, in 2 paragraphs, the specific mechanics of a soul-severing curse deployed via a proximity instrument, how it would seek the bond's resonance frequency, how it would follow that frequency to its source, how the destruction of the bond's connection would eliminate the composite casting capability entirely, and, in Hermione's specific case, would unmake the reclaimed magical heritage of the Dagworth-Granger line. The magic that was hers would revert to dormancy. 300 years of accumulated latency returned to silence. He knew what the locket was. He held the inventory record in both hands and thought about what to do. He could bring it to Harry and Hermione. He could show them the record, give them the location, let them handle it. They were better equipped than him in almost every measurable magical sense, and the composite cast could almost certainly neutralize a proximity instrument before it triggered. This was the sensible option. He could also not find it in time, or find it after it had been moved, or bring it to them and have them reach for it before the implications were fully assessed, because Harry's first instinct was always toward the physical object in front of him. Or the person carrying it could get close enough, in the time between notification and response, that 4 feet became 3, became 1. He could not guarantee it wouldn't be used. He sat with this for a long time too. Then he thought about what Sirius had said on the stairs. You can't see the shape of something from inside it. He thought about the word Sirius had used, guardian. He thought about the chess game in 1st year, the board, the pieces, the particular move that ends the match, the piece that makes that move and what happens to it. He had been 11 years old, and he had understood it with the instinctive clarity of someone who had spent his entire childhood playing chess with people better than him, which was everyone in his family, and had learned that the most important move was frequently not the winning move and frequently not made by the winning piece. He looked at the locket. He picked it up. It was heavier than it looked. The serpent on the front was finely made. Old work. Genuinely old. Whatever had originally lived inside it having been removed and replaced with something that had no business being inside a locket. He could feel the modification without knowing precisely how he felt it. Perhaps from 2 years of proximity to bonded magic. Perhaps from 47 pages of Hermione's notes. Perhaps from simply being Ron Weasley, who had always been more perceptive than anyone credited him with, and had learned not to correct this misapprehension, because the underestimation was useful. He put it around his neck. He got up. He walked toward where Harry and Hermione were. The activation was not loud. It was a pulse, contained, directional, the compressed release of a mechanism that had been built to do exactly one thing and was doing it. He felt it leave the locket and felt it reach, and what it reached for was the bond's frequency, the gold-silver resonance that was not present in him, that was not there because he was not Harry and he was not Hermione, and the bond had never been his, the door in the mindscape that the magic had always gently closed. The curse found no bond. It took approximately a quarter of a second to make this assessment. Then it did what contained curses do when they cannot reach their designated target. It reached for what was available, his magic, his core, the place where every spell he had ever cast had originated, the accumulated capability of 6 years of Hogwarts instruction and everything before it, the particular warmth of a magical system that had never been extraordinary, but had always, quietly, worked. He was on the ground. He did not remember falling. Harry was there first. Then Hermione. He could see them both from the floor, their faces very clear, the bond light between them briefly visible in the way it was only during extremity, and he thought distantly that it was strange to see it from the outside after all this time. "I put it on," he said. His voice worked, which was good. "The locket, I put it on." "We know," Harry said. He was holding Ron's hand, both hands, the grip of someone who was doing the only physical thing available to them. "It was going to reach you otherwise. I couldn't. I ran the options. I couldn't guarantee." "Ron, don't," he said. "I ran the options. This was the right one." He paused. Breathing was possible, but required specific attention. This isn't. I need you to know it wasn't about dying. I just found out what I was for. That's all. That's a good thing to find out." He looked at Hermione. "Page 47, he said. She was already very still. "What?" "Your notes. 5th year, the soul-severing section. I read it then. I recognized the locket from your description." He watched her face process this. "I've been reading your notes since 3rd year. I didn't tell you. I'm telling you now." She was quiet for a moment that contained several things simultaneously. "Everything?" she said. "All of it? You write very clearly." He paused. "I learned more from your notes than I did from 6 years of class." The moment held, then she opened her notebook. He watched her open it with the specific understanding of someone who knew her well enough to know what this meant. She was not retreating from him. She was doing the things she did when something mattered past the point where any other response was adequate. She was building the record. She was drafting. For him. "Hermione," he said. "I'm here," she said. She was writing, and her eyes were wet, and her hand was completely steady, which was the most Hermione thing he had ever seen. "I'm right here. Keep talking." He talked for 4 hours, which was longer than he expected and sufficient for what he needed to say. He told Harry that the chess move had been obvious from the start, and he had never understood why nobody in the history of the castle had put a better player in that room. He told Harry that he was proud of him, which he had never said directly, which he said directly now. He told Hermione that her cross-referencing system was better than she knew, but her margin annotations were too small, and she should write larger because some future person would need to read them. He told her that the Dagworth-Granger line producing her was the most logical thing that had ever happened, and he was glad he had been there to see it develop. He told Harry to win. He told Hermione to win her way. Madame Pomfrey came at the 2nd hour and confirmed in clinical language what they already knew. The magical core had been irreparably damaged. The body would continue for a time. The time was finite. Hermione was still writing at the 3rd hour. He could see the document from where he was lying. It was dense with legal language, the founding charter's amendment provisions, the Covenant's guardian clause, the specific conditions under which the Covenant's own magic could recognize a non-bonded party as a named protective instrument. "Will it work?" he asked. "The Covenant records acts of protection as amendments," she said. "It recorded what you did the moment you put it on. The formal framework is—" She paused. "I'm building the formal framework around what the Covenant has already done. It already recorded it. The magic noted your attempt before I knew to document it." She looked at him. "You're already in it, Ron. I'm just writing the words around something that's already true." He closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the candlelight in the room felt different, warmer, in a way that had no identifiable source. The bond light between Harry and Hermione which he could still see from his angle, had changed its quality slightly. Something had shifted in it, the way a document shifts when a final clause has been sealed. He did not make it to the 5th hour. 48 hours after Ron Weasley died in the Hogwarts hospital wing at the age of 17, the Malfoy family estate ceased to exist as an asset. The legal mechanism was the Covenant's Property Protection Clause, which held that any instrument deployed against a pre-ministry bond and its parties constituted an act of magical aggression against the instrument's custodian, which was Gringotts, and was therefore subject to the Ragnarok Accord's asset seizure provisions. The locket had been commissioned against a Covenant pair. The commission had been traced to Lucius Malfoy through his payment record, which the Gringotts Forensic Archive recovered in 11 minutes once Hermione submitted the seizure request. The transfer was filed on a Tuesday morning. It was immediate, it was irrevocable, it was entirely legal. The Malfoy estate, the house, the vaults, the land, the assets accumulated over 3 centuries of pure-blood political positioning, transferred to a holding account under Covenant authority to be distributed pursuant to the Guardian Clause. The Weasley family received it not as charity and not as compensation, but as the legal consequence of what the Covenant had recorded, the first guardian in 300 years, and what was owed to his house. Lucius Malfoy, receiving the notification in Azkaban, read the document twice. He read the name on the transfer instrument, Hermione Jean Granger, Lady Dagworth Granger, Covenant counterpart and filing party. He sat with this for a long time in a cell that smelled of salt and stone, and the accumulated cold of a building designed to make people feel that whatever they had been was finished. She had never addressed him directly. There was no letter, no statement, no acknowledgement of the irony that the girl he had called mudblood in a graveyard 2 years ago had, without apparent effort and without any visible satisfaction, removed from his family everything they had owned. She had simply filed the paperwork and moved on. In the mindscape, the library was quiet. The books were on their shelves. The candlelight held steady. There was a door in the far wall that had always been gently closed by the bond's own decision about its boundaries. The door was still closed, but beside it, set into the wall in the same stone as the library's construction, there was a small carved inscription that had not been there before, not placed by Harry and not placed by Hermione, placed by the Covenant itself in the specific registry of a living instrument acknowledging what had been given to it. Ronald Bilius Weasley, guardian of the Covenant, first of his kind in 300 years. He ran the options. He chose correctly. The library held it in its warmth. The candlelight did not flicker. The challenge was delivered by Gringotts' courier. This was the only mechanism sufficient to guarantee receipt. A goblin-carried instrument, Covenant-sealed, transmitted under the Ragnarok Accord's sovereign correspondence provisions. Whatever wards Lord Voldemort maintained around his current location, they were not goblin wards and could not exclude a goblin-delivered document. The courier appeared, set the scroll on the nearest surface, and was gone before anyone in the room had moved. The scroll was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph identified the sending parties, Lord Harry James Potter Peverell, and Lady Hermione Jean Dagworth Granger, acting under the sovereign authority of the Primordial Covenant of 1692, pre-ministry instrument, active and sealed, custodied by Gringotts under the Ragnarok Accords. The second paragraph issued, under Chapter 14 of the Wizengamot's founding charter, pre-ministry superseding all subsequent legislation, a formal sovereign challenge to the party known as Tom Marvolo Riddle, self-titled Lord Voldemort, to present himself for resolution of the stated conflict at the location specified, on the date specified, at the time specified. The challenge noted that failure to attend would constitute a legal forfeiture of all territorial and political claims made by the challenging party, and would be recorded as such in the Gringotts archive. The third paragraph specified Godric's Hollow, the West Country. Sunrise, the 22nd of May. He had never been challenged before, not legally, not formally, not by anyone who believed sufficiently in the outcome to put it in writing under their own name and seal it with a mark older than his knowledge of the wizarding world. He had been fought, ambushed, opposed, resisted. He had never been summoned. He found this insulting in a way that was not entirely rational, which he did not examine. He came. The ruins of the Potter's cottage were not dramatic. This was the thing about places where enormous things had happened. They did not maintain the enormity. The physical space contracted back to its ordinary dimensions once the event had passed, and what remained was rubble, an overgrown garden, and a stone foundation visible where the walls had collapsed inward. The yew tree at the corner of what had been the garden was larger than it had been. The gate was rusted but standing. Covenant resonance saturated the ground. Not visibly, not to any standard magical perception, but the ground at Godric's Hollow had absorbed, on the night of the 31st of October 1981, the magic of Lily Potter's willing sacrifice, which was the oldest class of protective magic in recorded history, and which had been, as Hermione had established in her research, the precise condition that had activated the dormant Covenant inscription in Harry's scar. The ground remembered, ancient magic always remembered. They had arrived an hour before sunrise. They had not brought wands as their primary instrument. They had brought them. Both had wands and both were competent in their use, but the wands were not the point, and had not been the point for some time. The point stood between them in the form of a bond that was 16 months from dormancy to full expression, that had been built in stages across 5 years, and that was, this morning, as completely developed as it was capable of being. The mindscape was perfectly ordered. The library was still. Every book was in its correct position. They stood in the ruins and waited. When Voldemort arrived, he arrived alone, which surprised neither of them. He would not have brought witnesses to something he expected to be brief. He was tall in the way that the body he occupied had been constructed to be, the ritual's product physically flawless, built for presence. The red eyes caught the pre-dawn light and held it differently than human eyes did. He moved through the ruined garden with the particular deliberateness of someone who has decided that they are too significant to hurry, and he stopped at the edge of what had been the cottage's threshold. He looked at them. He was expecting fear. Not the performed fear of people who were attempting to suppress it. He was familiar with that. It had a specific signature, a specific quality that his own perception, honed over 50 years of practice, could read from considerable distance. He was expecting the particular involuntary biological response of two people standing in the presence of something their nervous systems had correctly identified as a terminal threat. The response did not come. They were not suppressing fear, they were not managing it. It was not present. The soul ward, which had been active since the graveyard ritual in June 1995, and which did not announce itself but simply functioned, maintained a field around them that did not block emotion, but made the sustained generation of debilitating fear response functionally impossible in their shared space. They were not brave this morning in the sense of having overcome their fear. They were clear. The clarity was different from bravery and considerably more unsettling to encounter. He stood at the threshold for a moment longer than he intended. "Two of you," he said. His voice was the voice of someone who had decided on tone. Cold, dismissive, already narrativizing the encounter as beneath him. "I was sent a challenge by 2 children. You were sent a challenge by Lord Potter Peverell and Lady Dagworth Granger," Hermione said. "The distinction is relevant. Children don't have sovereign standing under the founding charter." "I have come," he said, "because the insult of the document required acknowledgement. I will not—" "You came," Harry said, "because the alternative was a legal forfeiture recorded in the Gringotts archive, and you cannot afford to have your territorial claims documented as void. He said it the way you state a fact. We know why you came. We don't need to agree on the framing." Voldemort looked at Harry. Something moved through his face that was not the anger his expression had arranged itself to display. It was subtler than anger, the recognition of a variable that had not been fully accounted for. He raised his wand. The Elder Wand produced a curse that had killed dozens of people over the course of Voldemort's documented career, and significantly more before the records began. It did not reach them. The soul ward did not block it dramatically. There was no counter-curse, no shield with a visible surface. The ward simply functioned as it had always functioned. It encountered the hostile magical intent at the point of entry into their shared space, and did what the bond had been doing to everything with hostile intent since the graveyard. It tagged it, and the tag corrupted the curse's structural integrity from inside its own frequency. And what arrived at the point of intended impact was not the killing curse, but the dissipated remnants of something that had lost its coherence en route. The ruins absorbed it, the ground took it, the Covenant resonance in the soil processed it the way old things process intrusions, quietly, without acknowledgement. Voldemort cast again. 3 times. Each attempt failed in the same manner, not deflected, corrupted. He stood in the ruined garden and cast the most powerful magic at his disposal, and watched it arrive diminished, and the expression on his face was not anger now. It was the expression of something encountering an incomprehensible structural failure in a system it has relied upon completely for 50 years. Hermione said, "Your wand doesn't work correctly anymore." He looked at her. "The soul ward has been in your blood since June of 1995. The bond's resonance has been propagating through your Horcrux network for 3 years. Your magic runs through the same architecture as your Horcruxes. You designed it that way. The network connects everything. She said this with the same register she brought to everything. Precise, sufficient. It has been failing in small ways for 36 months. Your followers have noticed and attributed it to Harry's resistance. That was incorrect. You are not. He stopped. This is not. We're going to use the soul strike now, Harry said. He was the anchor. The composite cast required initiation and completion. Hermione began it, which meant she designed the frequency and the direction, and Harry completed it, which meant he held it. He was the method. Both were necessary. Neither could do what the other did. She initiated. What came from between them was the gold-silver of their standard composite, but at a pressure and depth that the standard composite had never reached. Not louder. Lower, a frequency below the range of wand-cast magic, below the range of most magical perception, the specific register of something very old asserting itself through a medium that had been built over 3 years to carry it. Harry held the scar, not the scar as a wound, as a connection, the link that Voldemort had created on the night of October 31st, 1981, which had never been fully severed because Voldemort had taken Harry's blood in June 1995, and the taking had deepened it. The link was there. He had always been able to feel it. He had learned, in the mindscape, to understand its topology, where it ran, what it connected to, the specific pathways Voldemort had woven through his own Horcrux network over decades of soul-fragmenting magic. The soul strike moved through the scar link like a current through a wire. It reached the network, across locations simultaneously, because the soul strike was not a projectile and did not travel geographically. It traveled through connection, and the connections were all present in the architecture Voldemort himself had built. The Horcruxes destabilized, not exploded, not destroyed by force. They encountered a unified soul frequency and could not maintain coherence against it. A fragmented thing encountering wholeness does not shatter dramatically, it simply loses the argument. Each fragment of Voldemort's soul, sealed in its object across the geography of Britain, registered the resonance and could no longer hold its shape against it. One by one, and then simultaneously, the anchors failed. Voldemort knew. He knew the way you know something when the architecture of your entire existence has been built on a single structural principle, and that principle has just been disproved. Not through argument, through demonstration. He had shattered his soul to achieve permanence. It had never occurred to him in 50 years of study and theory and application that permanence built on division was not permanence at all. That a thing fractured into 7 pieces and distributed across 7 objects was not stronger than a thing that was whole. It was 6 additional points of failure. He came apart quietly, not with sound, not with the drama of a battle's ending. The body that the ritual had built with such precision in June 1995 simply ceased to maintain the coherence that required a soul to anchor it, and what remained was not a ruin but an absence. The space where he had been standing held nothing. The yew tree at the corner of the ruined garden did not move. The pre-dawn light continued to arrive from the east at the rate it had always arrived. The Death Eaters who had come, 3 of them, positioned at the garden's perimeter, who had believed this morning would be a demonstration and had positioned themselves to witness it, saw the thread. It became visible as Voldemort deteriorated. Not gradually. At the moment of his final dissolution, the bond's gold-and-silver thread snapped into full visibility, not the faint trace that Harry and Hermione could see at moments of extremity, not the clear sight that goblins saw, fully visible, present in the morning air between them like something that had always been there and had simply been waiting for the conditions to make itself apparent. The first Death Eater dropped his wand. He did not do it consciously. His hand simply opened. The wand fell into the long grass at the garden's edge, and he looked at it and did not pick it up. The second followed within 2 seconds. The third looked at the thread for a long moment. At the thing between Harry and Hermione that had no place in any category of magic he had been taught, that predated every institution he had given his allegiance to, that was clearly the operative force in what he had just witnessed, and set his wand on the stone foundation wall of the ruined cottage, with the deliberateness of someone making a decision rather than surrendering to one. Then there was no sound in the garden except the morning. Harry and Hermione stood in the ruins of his birthplace. The ground beneath them was saturated with the resonance of 300 years of covenant magic, 17 years of Lily Potter's sacrifice, and the conclusion of something that had been set in motion on the night he had survived a curse that should have killed him, and had not because his mother had loved him in a way that broke the expected parameters of what love was allowed to do. He breathed. She breathed. The thread between them settled from its full brilliance to the quiet warmth of its ordinary state, present, permanent, exactly where it had always been. The morning came. It was unremarkable in the way that mornings after enormous things tend to be unremarkable, the light the same temperature as every other May morning, the birds returning to their ordinary business, the ruined garden sitting in its silence with the patience of a place that has been waiting a long time and has now finished waiting. Harry looked at the space where Voldemort had been. Then, at Hermione, she was looking at her notebook. She had not opened it. She was simply holding it, which was different from everything. Hermione not writing, not documenting, not building the framework for what came next, just holding it. He left her with that for a moment. Then he said, Chapter 12. She looked up. What comes next? He said. She opened the notebook. They did not accept medals. The ministry sent a formal letter on the third day after Godric's Hollow. It was addressed to Lord Potter Peverell, which was correct, and it offered the Order of Merlin, first class, which was the highest civilian distinction in the wizarding world, and had not been awarded to anyone under 30 in its documented history. The letter was signed by the acting minister for magic, who had been acting for 11 days and would, if events proceeded as Hermione intended, be acting for a maximum of 4 more. Harry read the letter. He set it down. Hermione drafted the response, which thanked the ministry for its acknowledgement and informed them that Lord Potter and Lady Granger would be appearing before the Wizengamot at the session they were independently calling under Covenant sovereign authority at 10 o'clock on the 14th of June, and that the acting minister was encouraged to attend. It was not an invitation. The Wizengamot chamber was not designed to be entered from the gallery. There was a formal entrance at floor level, used by members with seats, and there were gallery stairs for observers, and these two categories had been institutionally distinct for 300 years because the institution preferred its hierarchies to be spatial as well as procedural. Harry and Hermione entered from the gallery stairs and walked down to the floor, which required passing through a gate marked members and authorized parties only, and the gate opened for them because the Covenant's sovereign authority, under the founding charter, classified them as exactly that. Nobody stopped them. They walked to the center of the chamber floor together. The 50 seats were occupied. The acting minister was in the observation position to the left of the chief warlock's chair. The chair was empty, which it had been since Dumbledore's death and would remain so until the session produced a successor. Ironshard of Gringotts was present in the chamber's goblin observer position, which had existed in the original gallery design and had been papered over during a renovation in 1823, and which Hermione had requested be reinstated 7 days ago. The reinstatement had taken 4 hours. The goblins had arrived before the paper was fully dry. Harry placed 2 documents on the central table. One was the new charter, 214 pages produced over 3 weeks, drafted by Hermione and reviewed by Gringotts' legal archive. Every clause sourced to pre-existing legal precedent in the founding charter or the Ragnarok Accords. Nothing invented, everything derived. The other was a single page. Ron's name at the top, the Covenant Guardian Amendment below it in the Covenant's own language, with the Gringotts seal. Hermione addressed the chamber. She spoke for 40 minutes, which was 20 minutes less than the charter's complexity warranted, and 20 minutes more than most Wizengamot presentations managed before losing the room. She did not lose the room. The charter was not ideological. It was procedural, building each provision on the one before it, each one traceable to existing law, none of it requiring anyone in the chamber to agree with an abstract principle they were uncomfortable with. She had designed it this way deliberately. Agreement with principle was volatile. Agreement with derivation was considerably more durable. The core provisions of the new charter, explicit legal protections for Muggle-born witches and wizards, codified not as special consideration but as the extension of existing ancient house protections to all magical persons, regardless of birth status, with the Covenant's own precedent of claiming Lady Granger's heritage as the governing case. The Hogwarts governance restructuring, the school's ancient charter restored as the primary governing document, and the Board of Governors reconstituted with mandatory representation from each of the 4 houses and from the Muggle-born liaison office, which was itself being elevated from its current underfunded advisory status to a permanent ministry division with its own budget line and legal standing. The Gringotts Accord formalization, the existing informal arrangement by which the goblins operated as independent financial and legal custodians was codified into statute, giving Gringotts explicit co-equal standing in matters of magical law where their accords predated ministry legislation. She was 3/4 of the way through the governance section when Dolores Umbridge stood. She had been present since the session opened. She was no longer in a ministry position. Her tenure as High Inquisitor had been dissolved along with the ministry's corrupted intermediate structure, but she retained her seat as a former senior undersecretary, which gave her floor rights. She rose with the specific quality of someone who has been waiting for the appropriate procedural moment and has identified it. Her robes were the same pink they had always been. Her expression was the same. "Under ministry authority," she said, her voice carrying the performance of reasonable objection, "this charter exceeds the scope of what a private legal instrument can mandate. The Wisengamot's own procedure requires." Hermione stopped. She looked at Umbridge. She said, "Under the pre-ministry covenant authority of House Potter-Peverell and House Dagworth-Granger, I hereby move that Dolores Jane Umbridge be stripped of her ministry title and barred from public service pending a formal veritaserum inquiry into her conduct during the 1995 to 1996 academic year. Specifically, the administration of a blood quill as a punitive instrument on students in her care, the issuing of illegal educational decrees against a sovereign lord of an ancient house, and the demonstrated pattern of ministry overreach documented in 47 filed complaints held in the Gringotts legal archive." The chamber was quiet. "I second," said Augusta Longbottom from the Longbottom seat, without standing. "I second," said Amelia Bones. From the Bones seat, without standing, the vote was called. 47 members voted in favor, 3 voted against. The 3 who voted against were escorted from the floor by goblins, not Aurors, not ministry enforcement personnel, but Ironshard's representatives who had entered through the reinstated Goblin Observer position and who performed this function with the specific efficiency of an institution that has been waiting 300 years for the chamber to remember it exists and is done waiting. Umbridge left without speaking further. Hermione turned back to the charter. She completed the governance section in 11 minutes. The vote on the full charter took 2 hours. Individual clauses were debated. 3 were amended in minor language points. Hermione accepted 2 of the amendments and declined the third, citing the founding charter's original phrasing as the governing text, which the member proposing the amendment could not refute, because the original phrasing was older than the member's objection and did not require his agreement to be operative. The final vote, 44 in favor, 6 against. Harry signed it as Lord Potter-Peverell. Hermione signed it as Lady Dagworth-Granger. Ironshard sealed it with the Gringotts instrument, which had not been used in this chamber since 1802, and which left an impression in the document that carried more legal weight than anything the ministry's own seal could produce. It was done. Before the session closed, the single-page document was read into the record. The clerk of the Wisengamot, who had held his position for 22 years and had read into the record births, deaths, appointments, exonerations, and more categories of legal instrument than he could accurately count, paused before beginning this one. He read it the way it deserved to be read, clearly, without abbreviation, without the procedural flatness that routine gave to language. Ronald Bilious Weasley, Covenant Guardian, first of his name in 300 years. He identified a weapon deployed against a pre-ministry instrument and its sovereign parties. In full knowledge of the consequence, he chose to place himself between the instrument and its target. The primordial covenant of 1692, acting in its capacity as a living instrument, recorded this act as an amendment to its own text at the moment of his choice, before the outcome was known, before any request was made. This amendment is irrevocable. The Guardian Clause, dormant since 1693, is hereby reinstated into active wizarding statute. The estate transferred under the Covenant's asset seizure provisions held in trust passes to House Weasley under the Guardian Compensation Clause. Not as gift, not as charity, but as the legal settlement owed to the house of a man who died protecting what the Covenant protected. The chamber was quiet during the reading. It was the same kind of quiet as the arena had been after the dragon sat down. Not the quiet of stunned reaction, but the quiet of 50 people registering something for which the available vocabulary was insufficient, and choosing, correctly, not to substitute noise for meaning. Harry looked at the center table during the reading. Then he looked at the door, which Ron would not come through. Then he looked at nothing in particular for a moment, which was something he had learned to do when the feeling was too large for the space he was in. Then he looked at Hermione. She was writing. The Hogwarts governance restructuring took 6 weeks to implement from the Gringotts ratification. The Board of Governors' existing membership was not removed. That would have required additional proceedings, and Hermione had no interest in performing more institutional surgery than the charter required. The existing members simply found, when they convened for the first time under the new structure, that they were now 12 people in a room that held 28, and the additional 16 seats were occupied by representatives of groups who had previously had no standing in the room at all. The 4 House representatives, one from each selected by their respective houses, were present. The Muggle-born liaison delegates were present. The first agenda item was the revision of the admissions welcome letter to include, from the 1998 academic year onward, a section explaining the Wizarding World's legal structure, the rights of Muggle-born students, and the contact information for the liaison office. It passed unanimously. The second agenda item was the restoration of the ancient curriculum provisions, which included protections against ministry interference in Hogwarts teaching content that had been gradually papered over since 1823. It also passed unanimously because nobody in the room wanted to be the person who argued against the school's own founding document in front of a goblin observer and 2 Covenant sovereigns. The board meeting ended at 3 o'clock. Hermione filed the minutes with the Gringotts archive before 5. They went back to Godric's Hollow in the evening, not as a plan. They had been at the ministry all day on separate administrative matters, Harry handling the final paperwork for the Death Eater trials, Hermione completing the liaison office's budget requisition, and it was Harry who said as they left the ministry's atrium into the cooling London evening that he wanted to go back. She had known he would. They apparated to the lane outside the village and walked. The ruins were the same. Of course they were. It had been 3 weeks. Old stone did not reconfigure itself in 3 weeks, and the rusted garden gate and the overgrown foundation and the yew tree that had grown undisturbed for 17 years were all exactly where they had been on the morning of the 22nd of May. The evening light was gold and long, the specific quality of a June evening that wanted to extend itself. They stood where they had stood. The thread between them was quiet. Not dormant. The thread was never dormant anymore, had not been since the Department of Mysteries, had not been fully invisible since Godric's Hollow, but quiet in the way that something is quiet when it has reached the condition it was always moving toward and is now simply present in that condition. Not performing itself, not building toward anything, just there. Harry looked at the space where the cottage had been. His parents had stood in this garden. His mother had worked the magic that had made this morning possible in a way that neither she, nor his father, nor anyone living at the time could have anticipated. She had died for him, and the dying had activated something 17 years old and 3 centuries dormant, and it had unfolded from that single act of love across nearly 2 decades into everything that had happened since. She had not known she was writing the first line of a very long document. She had simply loved him. He thought about Ron. He thought about him the way you think about someone who is gone in the way they chose to go. Not with the helpless grief of a loss that was only loss, but with the specific weight of a person whose end was also their fullest expression. Ron had run the options. He had found his function. He had walked toward them with the locket around his neck and the full knowledge of what he was doing and the specific satisfaction, which Harry understood in retrospect from everything Sirius had told them and everything Ron's face had contained in his last 4 hours, of a person who has answered the question they have been asking since they were old enough to ask it. What am I for? This. This exactly. He was in the Covenant now. Recorded. Irrevocable. The magic had noted his act before any human had thought to document it, which was the thing about ancient instruments. They did not require explanation, they simply recognized truth when it was produced. Hermione was standing beside him. She had the notebook in her hand, but she was not writing. She had not opened it since they arrived. She was looking at the ruins the way she looked at primary sources, with the attention of someone who knows the document contains information they have not finished extracting. Ignatius Peverell's heir stood somewhere near here, she said. When he signed it, 1692, 300 years, and 6 years from our end. She was quiet for a moment. It was always going to be us, not because it was predetermined, because we were the conditions the Covenant required, the dormant line, the Peverell heir, the bond that activated both of those things simultaneously. She turned the notebook over in her hands. The magic didn't choose us. We satisfied the requirements. Is that different? She considered this honestly, which was the only way she considered anything. I think so, she said. Prophecy requires surrender. Covenant requires participation. The thread between them caught the evening light in the specific way it did at moments of stillness. Not gold exactly, not silver, the color between them that had no name in any reference she had located. It was the color of something that had been built rather than found. Built in the moment Harry wrote to her from Privet Drive with words that were partly hers. Built in a vault 300 feet below Diagon Alley with a document warm to the touch. Built in a library that existed in a space between two people's minds, where her books and his books argued about their organizational systems in the first hour they laughed. Built in a corridor where Ron Weasley had looked at a locket and run the options. She put the notebook in her bag. This was the thing Harry had waited for, without knowing he was waiting for it. Hermione not writing, not building, not drafting the next framework for the next problem that required solving. Simply standing in the ruins of his parents' house in the evening light, with the thread between them quiet and the work, for this moment only, finished. The Ministry had the charter. Hogwarts had its guardian. The Gringotts archive held everything that had happened, dated and sealed and irrevocable in the specific permanent way of things that do not require anyone's continued agreement to remain true. They stood there until the light changed. Neither of them moved toward the gate. There was time. There was, for the first time in the 6 years since a gold-silver thread had wound itself around a cauldron in a graveyard, and the Covenant had begun the work of making itself visible, nothing that required them to be anywhere other than here. The thread settled. Permanent, in the way that things built rather than found are permanent. Not because they cannot be damaged, but because the building of them was an act, and the act was already complete, and complete things do not require maintenance to remain complete. They had chosen not to be alone. This was what it had always been. This was what had unmade everything that could not withstand it. The end.